Welcome, friends. Come on in and get comfortable. Whether you're curled beneath a favourite blanket, settling into your pillows, or simply allowing the quiet of the evening to gather around you after a long day, I am glad you are here. Perhaps the room is softly lit. Perhaps the house beyond your door has already grown still, and perhaps the sounds of the day are beginning to fade into the gentler rhythm of night time. There is nowhere else you need to be for a while. This is a story meant to unfold slowly, with no hurry at all. So, before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these journeys into the past. And let me know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. For now, settle a little deeper into the quiet. Let the modern world become distant at the edges, and imagine instead a city evening more than a century ago, when carriage wheels sounded against damp streets, household clocks ticked heavily on mantelpieces, and gas lamps began glowing one by one through the mist. Tonight, we are stepping back into Victorian high society, into a world in which an evening ball did not begin when the musicians lifted their bows. It began days, sometimes weeks, before the first carriage reached the door, and very often it began with an envelope. In a prosperous London townhouse, somewhere beyond the noise of the commercial streets, the morning post might arrive while breakfast was still being served. Silver covers rested over dishes on the dining room sideboard. Tea steamed gently beside cups of thin porcelain. Newspapers lay folded beside toast racks, and servants moved almost silently across carpets that had been swept before the household descended. Among the ordinary correspondence could appear a stiff cream envelope, heavier than the rest, addressed in careful script. Its contents might be an invitation to a ball. Victorian invitations among fashionable families could be surprisingly formal objects. They gave the host's name, the occasion, the date, and the hour, and they carried an assumption that everyone involved understood a complicated language of social obligations. One did not simply decide whether the evening sounded enjoyable. The household considered who was giving the ball, who was likely to attend, whether another engagement had already been accepted, and whether declining might be interpreted as indifference, illness, mourning, or something more deliberate. No one can quite agree on how rigidly every fashionable family observed these rules, because Victorian society was never as uniform as etiquette manuals like to pretend. Yet among families deeply concerned with rank and reputation, an invitation could carry considerable weight. A mother might study it with particular attention if she had unmarried daughters. The Victorian social season, especially in London, offered carefully supervised opportunities for young men and women of similar social circles to meet. A ball was entertainment, certainly, but it could also become part of the quiet machinery through which friendships were strengthened, introductions arranged, marriages considered, and family alliances observed. That did not mean every young woman receiving an invitation immediately dreamed of romance. Some looked forward mainly to dancing, others worried about being overlooked. A few may have dreaded the entire ordeal while knowing that admitting such a thing would hardly simplify matters. The first practical concern was often the calendar. Large households kept track of dinners, concerts, theatre visits, receptions, calls, and dances with considerable care. An accepted invitation created an obligation. Arriving too early could be awkward. Arriving far too late might be interpreted as carelessness, although fashionable lateness itself was hardly unknown. Then came the question of dress. Even before a wardrobe door opened, decisions had to be made. A gown worn recently in front of the same circle might require alteration. Ribbons could be replaced. Lace might be rearranged. Flowers could be changed. Jewellery had to suit the neckline and the importance of the occasion. Gloves needed to be clean and unmarked. Shoes might require attention from a servant. A fan had to be found and sometimes repaired. For wealthier women, clothing was rarely the work of one pair of hands. Dressmakers, seamstresses, ladies' maids, milliners, laundresses, and specialists in embroidery or trimming could all contribute to an appearance that, once finished, was expected to seem effortless. That appearance concealed hours of labour. In the servants' part of the house, preparations might begin almost immediately after the invitation was accepted. A maid could inspect stored gowns for dust or damage. Delicate fabrics might be brushed rather than washed. Lace needed careful handling. Silks could not simply be treated like ordinary household linen, and some stains presented problems that no amount of determination could solve without harming the cloth. Victorian households relied upon an assortment of cleaning methods involving powders, spirits, soaps, brushes, and patient spot treatment. Recipes circulated for removing grease or refreshing fabric, though some mixtures would make a modern conservator uneasy. Even now, historians continue to debate how commonly certain published household remedies were actually used, because advice books recorded ideals and possibilities rather than every private routine. Meanwhile, the men of the household faced their own preparations. A gentleman's evening clothes might appear simpler beside an elaborate ball gown, but simplicity did not mean carelessness. His coat required brushing, his linen had to be immaculate, shoes were polished until they reflected the firelight, gloves, often pale, needed to be spotless, a cravat or white tie demanded neat arrangement, and an evening waistcoat could quietly display taste without appearing excessively showy. Servants carried much of this invisible burden. A valet examined buttons and seams. A lady's maid considered whether a gown needed pressing, or whether a particular ornament would sit properly in the hair. Footmen might later be required for the journey and arrival. The coachman needed to know when the family intended to leave, and the carriage itself had to be ready. Outside, the city continued without concern for any of it. Delivery carts passed through wet streets. Shopkeepers attended to customers beneath signs darkened by soot. Horses steamed faintly in colder weather. In quieter squares, bare branches moved against pale afternoon skies, and the lamps would soon be lit. Inside the fashionable house, however, the invitation had changed the rhythm of several days. There might be another small custom to consider calling cards. The exchange of visits and cards formed part of the social structure surrounding invitations. A card left at the right house at the right time could acknowledge acquaintance, maintain connection, or indicate that a family had returned to town. To modern eyes, it may seem remarkably complicated for something small enough to disappear beneath a teacup. But to Victorian society, such objects helped organise a world in which relationships depended heavily upon ritual. Some people followed those rituals more strictly than others. Those who wrote etiquette books often complained about breaches of manners, which is perhaps useful evidence that real people did not behave perfectly. As afternoon light faded, the household might still have several days before the ball itself. There was time yet for fittings, repairs, decisions over jewellery, consultations with dressmakers, and perhaps a quiet worry over whether another guest would appear wearing something too similar. Beyond the windows, a bell from a nearby church marked the hour. Somewhere farther away came the muted clatter of carriage wheels. Fires settled lower behind iron grates, and servants moved through passages carrying folded fabric, polished shoes, and messages between rooms. The ball had not begun. No music played, no dancers had entered the ballroom, yet already, in bedrooms, dressing rooms, workrooms, kitchens, stables, and servants' halls, an entire household had begun to turn toward one approaching evening. By the time the invitation had been placed safely among the household papers, attention could turn toward the wardrobe, where the practical business of appearing in fashionable society truly began. For a woman expected at an important evening ball, choosing what to wear was rarely a simple matter of opening a cupboard and selecting a favourite gown. Clothing carried messages about age, wealth, marital status, taste, and respectability, and the wrong combination of fabric, colour, or ornament could attract precisely the kind of notice that polite society claimed not to notice at all. In a well-appointed bedroom or dressing room, tall wardrobes stood against patterned walls, their polished wooden doors opening onto carefully arranged garments. Drawers held gloves, stockings, ribbons, handkerchiefs, and folded pieces of lace. Boxes protected artificial flowers and delicate accessories. Jewellery might remain elsewhere under lock and key, while more fragile gowns hung covered or were stored with special care to protect them from dust. A lady and her maid might begin by considering the importance of the ball. A large gathering hosted by a prominent family called for greater formality than a smaller private dance. An unmarried young woman might be encouraged toward pale colours and comparatively fresh, delicate decoration, while married women generally possessed greater freedom to wear richer shades, stronger jewellery, and more elaborate materials. These conventions changed over the decades, and no one can quite agree whether fashionable society followed every rule as strictly as etiquette or writers suggested. Personal preference, Money, age, family tradition, and the judgment of individual hostesses all complicated the supposedly neat system. Still, colour mattered. White remained especially associated with youthful evening dress, while soft pinks, blues, creams, and pale greens appeared frequently in fashionable wardrobes. Older or married women could choose deeper reds, purples, golds, blacks, and stronger combinations. Black itself did not automatically mean mourning, although Victorian mourning customs were so elaborate that the precise material and ornamentation of a dark gown might carry meanings immediately understood by experienced observers. Fabric mattered just as much. Silk possessed a soft richness that caught candlelight beautifully. Satin reflected light more boldly. Tulle could produce airy layers around a skirt. Velvet offered depth and warmth, particularly in colder months, while lace softened necklines and sleeves. Some gowns combined several materials, their effect changing as the wearer crossed a room beneath chandeliers or passed through the warmer pools of light cast by lamps and candles. Long before electricity flooded ballrooms with uniform brightness, evening dress was seen under shifting illumination. Gaslight became increasingly important during the Victorian period, but candles continued to appear in many interiors, especially in decorative arrangements and older houses. Even beeswax candles, descendants of the expensive lights once favoured in churches, monasteries, and aristocratic halls centuries earlier, still carried an association with refinement. A fabric that looked subdued in daylight could appear remarkably alive once touched by warm evening light. The season influenced the decision as well. A winter ball demanded practical thought before elegance could even be enjoyed. Heavy cloaks, often lined or trimmed with fur, protected delicate gowns during the carriage journey. Shawls could be drawn around bare shoulders. Evening shoes, made for polished floors rather than muddy streets, were protected until arrival. A summer ball presented different concerns. Lighter fabrics were welcome, but crowded rooms could become warm. Flowers wilted. Gloves became uncomfortable. A woman might find herself carrying a fan not merely as an ornament, but as an entirely useful companion through several hours of dancing. For wealthy families, there was also the question of whether a gown should be new. Fashion changed quickly enough that an older dress could reveal its age through the shape of the skirt, the position of the waist, the trimming of the bodice, or the arrangement of sleeves. Yet even affluent households did not necessarily discard expensive garments after a single appearance. Good silk represented considerable value. Fine lace might pass between generations. A gown could be altered, retrimmed, reshaped, or combined with newer accessories. A different sash could transform the waist. Fresh flowers could change the impression around the neckline. New lace might conceal an older edge. A skilled dressmaker could adjust the bodice, or reorganize the trimming so effectively that acquaintances might register novelty without identifying exactly what had changed. This practice had roots far older than Victorian fashion. For generations, costly cloth had been preserved, cut apart, handed down, and remade. In medieval manor houses, wool garments could be patched repeatedly, while valuable textiles belonging to wealthy households were treated almost as property in their own right. The 19th century ballroom was more glittering than a medieval hall, but the habit of respecting expensive fabric had not entirely disappeared. Shoes were another quiet concern. Ballroom shoes for women were often light, delicate, and relatively thin. They needed to coordinate with the gown, and because dancing placed unusual strain upon them, their condition mattered. A loose ribbon or weakened seam could become troublesome midway through an evening. A lady's maid therefore examined such details carefully before departure. Then there were gloves. For formal evening occasions, gloves were essential. They completed the visual line of the arm and helped satisfy contemporary expectations surrounding modesty and physical contact during dancing. White or pale gloves were common, though their exact length and style changed with fashion, because they could easily become marked. A prudent guest might possess more than one pair. Fans waited nearby. A fan could be made from silk, lace, painted paper, feathers, carved ivory, mother of pearl, or other materials depending on cost and fashion. Later generations developed an entertaining mythology, claiming that every tiny movement of a fan carried a secret romantic message. Some gestures certainly acquired social meanings, and flirtation undoubtedly occurred behind fluttering fans. but historians remain cautious about treating elaborate published fan languages as universal codes followed by every ballroom guest. Jewellery required another series of decisions. Pearls offered softness. Diamonds glittered brilliantly beneath chandeliers. Garnets, emeralds, sapphires, and other stones could introduce stronger colour. Family jewels carried histories of their own, sometimes linking the wearer to mothers, grandmothers, marriages, inheritances, and households that had long since changed. Yet fashionable restraint remained important. Too little decoration might appear plain at a grand occasion, but too much could seem vulgar or desperate for attention. Victorian high society was fond of rules that required visible wealth, while pretending wealth should never look deliberately displayed. Gentlemen faced fewer choices of colour, though not fewer expectations. By the later Victorian decades, formal evening wear increasingly favoured dark coats and trousers, white shirts, white ties, and restrained waistcoats. Earlier decades allowed somewhat more variety, but the general movement was toward a dark masculine silhouette beside the brighter gowns of women. The effect in a ballroom could be striking clusters of black coats moving among silks in cream, rose, blue, and gold. A gentleman's clothing needed to fit properly without appearing theatrical. Linen had to be crisp, shoes had to shine, gloves needed to be fresh, waistcoat buttons should sit neatly, and the tie required careful arrangement. Even a slightly careless appearance could be interpreted as disrespect toward the host or indifference toward the occasion. As evening drew nearer, selected garments might be laid carefully across a bed or hung where they could be inspected again. Outside the windows, dusk gathered over rows of rooftops. Horses passed somewhere along the street below, their steps softened by distance. A church bell marked another hour. Much as bells had marked the passing day for generations before, inside, silk rested beside lace. Polished shoes waited near the hearth, and pale gloves remained folded in their boxes. Nothing had yet been worn. There was still sewing to finish, fabric to smooth, hair to arrange, and an entire sequence of private preparation ahead. But the evening's appearance had begun to take shape, piece by piece, in the quiet rooms above the sleeping city. Once the gown had been chosen, the work of making it suitable for the approaching ball passed more fully into the hands of people whose names seldom appeared on invitations. Behind the polished doors of fashionable drawing rooms and beneath the bright surfaces of high society, an entire world of skilled labour supported the effortless appearance expected of wealthy guests. Dressmakers, seamstresses, tailors, ladies' maids, apprentices, laundresses, and shop assistants worked with needles, thread, brushes, irons, ribbon, lace, and endless patience so that a lady might step into a ballroom looking as though elegance had simply happened to her. In many prosperous households, the final preparation of a gown began with inspection. The dress might be carried into a bedroom or dressing room and spread carefully across a bed covered with a clean sheet. It could also be hung near a window where daylight revealed flaws that candlelight might conceal. A lady's maid examined the hem, the fastenings, the decorative trimming, the sleeves, and the delicate areas beneath the arms where fabric could show signs of wear. Silk was beautiful, but it was not forgiving. A small pull in the fabric, an opening seam, or a loosened bead could become far more noticeable once the wearer began moving through a crowded ballroom. Trains could catch beneath shoes, hooks could bend, ribbons could fray. Lace could tear so quietly that no one noticed until the garment was already in use. For this reason, an evening gown often received the kind of careful attention that a household gave to valuable furniture or silver. If the alterations were simple, a skilled lady's maid might handle them herself. Better trained maids could sew neatly, repair lace, replace hooks and eyes, refresh trimmings, and make minor adjustments to the fit. Larger changes usually required a professional dressmaker. In fashionable districts of London, dressmakers maintained establishments ranging from modest workrooms to elegant businesses serving wealthy clients. Behind the front rooms where customers discussed fabrics and fashion, several women might labour for long hours over cutting, fitting, stitching, and finishing. Patterns did not always resemble the convenient printed pieces familiar to later generations. Skilled dressmakers worked from measurements, experience, fashion plates, existing garments, and carefully shaped pieces of cloth. Bodices demanded particular precision because the fitted silhouette of Victorian evening dress depended heavily upon exact construction. No one can quite agree on the daily experience of every seamstress working for fashionable society. Some established dressmakers built successful businesses and employed many assistants, while others survived on uncertain wages in crowded rooms. Contemporary observers frequently wrote about the exhausting hours endured by needlewomen, especially during the busier social seasons, though conditions varied greatly from one workshop to another. When fashionable families prepared for a succession of dinners and balls, deadlines could become severe. A last-minute invitation might create sudden work. A client might decide that a gown appeared unfashionable after seeing a newly arrived style. A bodice could require adjustment after a fitting. Trimming might be changed because another woman had recently worn something too similar. Such concerns may seem delicate beside the harder realities of 19th century life, yet within high society they possessed an importance of their own. Clothing acted as a language, and the people who constructed it understood that language in detail. A dressmaker could alter the appearance of a gown without replacing its expensive foundation. Old ribbon came away first. New trimming might follow the curves of a bodice. Lace could be gathered differently. A line of artificial flowers might be removed and replaced with fresh blossoms shortly before departure. A skirt could receive additional decoration around the hem, where movement made every detail visible during dancing. Pins gathered temporarily in small cushions nearby. Spools of thread rolled across work tables. Scissors rested beside scraps of silk too valuable to throw away carelessly. Even tiny fragments could be saved for repairs, covered buttons, or decorative details. There was something almost timeless in the scene. Centuries earlier, in the chambers of castles and manor houses, skilled hands had also repaired costly garments by firelight, preserving wool, velvet, silk, and embroidery because fine cloth represented wealth. Victorian fashion was different in shape and scale, yet the habit of guarding valuable fabric remained. A gown might belong to the industrial 19th century, but the quiet concentration required to maintain it would have been familiar to generations long before. Men's evening clothes required their own specialists. A gentleman's tailor worked toward precision rather than ornament. The coat had to sit correctly across the shoulders. Sleeves needed the proper length. Trousers had to fall cleanly over polished shoes. A waistcoat should lie smoothly without bunching beneath the coat. Fashionable masculine clothing increasingly depended upon excellent cut. The less decoration a garment carried, the more obvious poor tailoring became. A dark evening coat offered little distraction from an awkward shoulder or badly shaped waist. Tailors therefore relied upon carefully taken measurements and the accumulated knowledge of how cloth behaved once it was placed on a moving body. At home, the valet took over. He brushed coats to remove dust and lint, inspected buttons, checked seams, aired garments if necessary, and prepared fresh linen. Brushes made from natural bristles were ordinary tools of respectable clothing care. Mud or dust from streets could cling to outer garments, and careful brushing prolonged their life. Women's gowns could not always be treated so firmly. Fragile silk, lace, net, and decorative surfaces demanded gentler methods. Dry powders were sometimes recommended for absorbing grease. Spirits and other cleaning agents appeared in household manuals. Some recipes included substances that modern users would approach with caution, especially around delicate dyes. Even now, historians continue to debate how faithfully people followed printed household instructions. Manuals often suggested elaborate solutions, while practical servants may have trusted simpler methods learned through experience. The iron presented another difficulty. Flat irons were heated near a stove or fire, then tested before use. Too cool, and they accomplished little. Too hot, and they could scorch cloth in moments. A maid might hold an iron near her cheek to judge its warmth or test it on spare fabric. Damp pressing cloths helped control heat and moisture. For delicate evening materials, caution mattered more than speed. Elsewhere in the house, gloves might be examined for marks, stockings could be checked for small holes, shoe ribbons were strengthened, fans were inspected for broken sticks or loose silk. A missing hook from the back of a bodice might demand more immediate attention than an ornament worth many times its cost. These small repairs were often completed in rooms rarely seen by guests. The servants' hall might contain sturdy wooden tables marked by years of use. Workrooms could be narrow and warm. In some homes, sewing took place close to a window during the day because natural light was precious. By evening, gas or lamps extended the hours available. Just as earlier, needleworkers had depended upon candles beside soot-darkened walls. There was a quiet rhythm to the work. Thread passed through cloth, scissors opened and closed, a maid bent close to a seam. Somewhere below, a kitchen range burned steadily. Footsteps moved along the back stairs. A bell connected to one of the family rooms might suddenly tremble on its board, summoning a servant away from whatever task occupied her hands. Then the sewing resumed. The invisible labour behind fashionable life rarely moved according to the elegant pace experienced upstairs. A lady could spend half an hour deciding between two ribbons. Someone else might spend far longer removing the old one and stitching the new one into place. A gentleman could expect perfectly polished shoes without thinking about the servant standing beside a lamp, working wax into the leather until its surface became smooth and dark. One lesser-known concern involved the possibility of dye transferring from fashionable fabrics. 19th century textile dyes produced increasingly vivid colours, but some were unstable, and certain synthetic dyes or chemical treatments carried genuine health risks. Bright greens became especially notorious because arsenic compounds were used in some pigments and dyes, though the danger varied according to the material and manufacturing method. Those who wore or made fashionable goods did not always understand the risks clearly. Some chroniclers and medical writers warned about poisonous colours in clothing and decorative objects. Others treated the alarm as exaggerated. The truth lay uneasily between fashion and industrial chemistry. Within the peaceful bedroom of a wealthy household, however, attention remained fixed on immediate matters. A seam had been repaired. A row of tiny hooks was secure. Fresh ribbon lay smoothly against the bodice. The gown was lifted carefully and allowed to hang free so its skirt would not be crushed. Nearby, a small work basket held the remnants of the afternoon thread, pins, scraps of lace, a thimble, and a pair of scissors. Outside, evening mist settled into the streets. Through rows of tall windows, lights appeared one after another. Horses moved slowly through the damp air. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell marked the hour, its sound fading between rooftops before returning once more. The dressmaker's work was nearly finished. The servant's work was not, and the gown itself, quiet now in the lamplight, still had to become part of a person. Before jewels could glitter and music could begin, there remained the intimate business of bathing, grooming, perfume, hair, skin, and all the private rituals by which Victorian society prepared the body for public view. With the gown repaired and the final alterations nearly complete, preparation moved from fabric to the body itself. Long before the first guest entered the ballroom, there was washing to be done, hair to be arranged, nails to be cleaned, teeth to be brushed or powdered, skin to be treated, and perfume to be applied with restraint. Victorian beauty rituals could be elaborate, but they were also deeply shaped by ideas of respectability, health, class, and privacy. In a prosperous household, bathing was far more convenient than it had been for most people in earlier centuries, though even wealthy Victorians did not always bathe in the modern way, or as frequently as later generations might expect. Bathrooms became more common during the 19th century, especially in affluent urban homes, but hot water still required labour. Servants might carry heated water upstairs in jugs or cans. A portable bath could be brought into a dressing room. Towels had to be warmed, soap laid ready, and screens arranged for privacy. The entire process depended upon unseen work. A maid might begin by setting a fire or checking that the room was comfortably warm, particularly in winter. Coal smoke pressed against the city outside, while indoors a small grate offered a circle of warmth against the damp. Water heated below stairs and travelled upward through the household, one container at a time. This was a very different rhythm from turning a tap. A full immersion bath might not always be necessary before an evening engagement. Washing at a basin remained common. Face, hands, neck, arms, and other areas could be cleaned carefully using warm water, soap, cloths, and sponges. Hair was not necessarily washed on the same day as an important event, because drying and arranging long hair required time. No one can quite agree on how often upper-class Victorian women wash their hair, because surviving advice differs widely. Some household manuals recommended relatively infrequent washing, while others suggested more regular cleansing depending on hair type, climate, and personal habit. What seems clear is that brushing mattered enormously. Long hair might be brushed for an extended period. A maid separated it gently, working out tangles and distributing its natural oils from root to end. Hairbrushes of good quality were valued objects, often kept with combs, pins, bottles, and small grooming tools on the dressing table. Brushing was sometimes surrounded by beliefs that now seem curious. Repeated strokes were thought by many to strengthen the hair, improve its shine, or stimulate the scalp. Various oils and pomades were used when hair seemed dry. Macassar oil became famous enough that upholstered furniture eventually required protective cloths, known as antimacassars, to prevent oily hair preparations from staining chair backs. A dressing room prepared for the evening could therefore carry a complicated mixture of scents. There was soap, warmed linen, perhaps lavender water, hair oil, beeswax from nearby candles, and the faint smoke of the fire. Bottles of perfume stood among brushes and combs. Violet, rose, lavender, orange blossom, and other floral scents were popular, while stronger perfumes might include musk or more exotic ingredients. Perfume was expected to be noticeable without overwhelming a room. Victorian etiquette often praised moderation, even while fashionable society surrounded itself with richly scented flowers, soaps, hair products, sachets, and cosmetics. A little perfume might be touched to the wrists, hair, handkerchief, or clothing. Some women carried small scent bottles in decorative cases. Before fragrance came the face. Cosmetics occupied an uncertain place in respectable Victorian culture. Fashionable ideals praised a naturally pale complexion, clear skin, bright eyes, and a gentle flush. Obvious paint carried associations with the theatre and with women whom respectable society preferred not to imitate openly. Yet cosmetics certainly existed, and many women used them quietly. Rice powder, pearl powders, cold creams, rouges, and tinted preparations circulated widely. A very light application could soften shine beneath ballroom lights. Powder might be applied to the face, neck, shoulders, and arms, especially when evening gowns exposed more skin than daytime dresses. Rouge could imitate the healthy colour that etiquette preferred to describe as entirely natural. Some beauty preparations were harmless enough, others were not. Earlier generations had used lead compounds in whitening cosmetics, and dangerous ingredients continued to appear in 19th century preparations. Arsenic was promoted in some beauty products and medicines with alarming confidence. Belladonna had also been associated with cosmetic use in earlier European traditions because it could enlarge the pupils, though such practices carried obvious risks. Victorian advertisements were often full of miraculous claims. A cream might promise to remove freckles, a tonic could supposedly restore hair, a lotion might claim to preserve youth. Some remedies relied on ingredients such as glycerin, rosewater, almond oil, or beeswax. Others were mixtures whose exact composition remained conveniently vague. Even now, historians continue to debate how widely the more dangerous beauty products were actually used. Advertisements reveal what manufacturers hoped to sell, not necessarily what every fashionable household accepted. Safer domestic remedies remained popular. Rosewater could refresh the skin. Oatmeal preparations were recommended for softness. Cold cream, traditionally made from combinations of fats or waxes and scented water, removed dirt and cosmetics while soothing dry skin. Cucumber appeared in beauty advice. Lemon juice was sometimes recommended for freckles or discoloration, although repeated use could irritate sensitive skin. The mouth received attention too. A respectable appearance depended partly upon clean teeth and fresh breath. Toothbrushes existed and became increasingly common during the 19th century, though their quality and materials varied. Tooth powders could contain chalk, charcoal, powdered cuttlefish bone, bicarbonate compounds, herbs, or aromatic ingredients. Not every recipe was wise. Some abrasive powders cleaned stains by gradually wearing the tooth surface, while acidic preparations could damage enamel. Dental knowledge was improving, but many people still relied on traditional methods that mixed genuine cleanliness with questionable chemistry. Breath might be freshened using herbs, lozenges, or scented preparations. Long before Victorian drawing rooms, people had chewed herbs such as parsley, mint, or fennel to sweeten the breath. Such simple practices survived beside bottled preparations sold by chemists. Hands required particular care because dancing made them unusually visible. Nails were trimmed and cleaned. Hands could be softened with creams or lotions. Gloves would cover them for much of the evening, yet putting a clean pale glove over rough or damp skin was uncomfortable. A little powder helped the glove slide into place. gentlemen followed their own grooming routines. A valet prepared warm water for shaving, laid out razors, brushes, soap, towels, and combs, and attended to clothing while his employer washed. Facial hairstyles changed dramatically across the Victorian period. Some men favoured clean-shaven faces, while others wore whiskers, moustaches, or full beards. Beard oils and moustache waxes could give shape and shine. Hair was combed carefully, sometimes with pomade. A gentleman might use cologne, but heavy scent was generally discouraged in respectable masculine etiquette. He, too, attended to hands and nails. Ballroom society was a world of closer observation. A poorly brushed coat, dirty cuff, stained glove, or neglected fingernail could undermine an otherwise expensive appearance. As the preparations continued, daylight gradually withdrew from the windows. Gas lamps glowed behind glass in the street below. Inside, the bedroom became warmer and softer. A maid carried away used water. Fresh towels remained folded beside the basin. Brushes returned to their places. Small bottles stood beneath the mirror, catching points of lamplight. The city beyond the curtains grew quieter, though it was far from asleep. Carriages already moved toward dinners and theatres. Somewhere nearby, a clock struck the hour. The sound drifted through walls and across rooftops, joining the faint rumble of wheels on wet stone. Within the dressing room, the transformation remained unfinished. The skin had been washed and lightly scented. Hair had been brushed until it shone. Hands were clean. Linen waited fresh and ready. Now the complicated architecture of evening dress itself could begin. Layer after layer, each piece fastening the wearer more firmly into the fashionable silhouette expected beneath the chandeliers. Once washing and grooming were complete, the dressing room entered its most intricate phase. The evening gown itself was only the visible surface of a far more complicated structure. And beneath its silk, satin, lace, or tulle, lay several carefully arranged layers that shaped the body according to the fashion of the moment. To modern eyes, the finished appearance could seem effortless, almost weightless under ballroom light. In reality, it depended on fastening, tying, smoothing, lifting, pinning, and adjusting one garment after another. The process usually began with linen. A woman first put on a chemise, a simple undergarment worn close to the skin. It helped protect more expensive clothing from perspiration and body oils, and, because it was washable, it formed an important practical layer beneath garments that were far more difficult to clean. Drawers, increasingly common during the 19th century, followed, along with stockings secured by garters. These garments were modest, useful, and largely hidden from view. Then came the corset. Few objects have become more closely associated with Victorian fashion, and few have generated more exaggeration. Some corsets were certainly worn very tightly, and extreme tight lacing attracted both admirers and critics. Yet no one can quite agree on how widespread the most severe practices really were. Medical writers complained about compressed ribs and displaced organs, while fashion illustrations often promoted waistlines that were difficult to achieve without significant shaping. At the same time, surviving garments show that many women wore corsets in more moderate ways. For most wearers, the corset was not simply an instrument of vanity. It supported the torso, distributed the weight of skirts, and helped create the fashionable line required for fitted bodices. The garment was usually strengthened with whalebone, steel, or other stiff materials, though the word whalebone referred more accurately to baleen rather than true bone. Lacing at the back allowed adjustment, while busks at the front could make dressing and undressing easier. A lady's maid often assisted. The woman might stand beside the bed or dressing table while the maid tightened the laces gradually rather than with sudden force. The aim was to create the desired shape without making movement impossible. Breathing had to remain comfortable enough for conversation, supper, and hours of dancing. Ballroom life would have been difficult otherwise. Once the corset sat correctly, the silhouette began to take form. The precise layers that followed depended heavily on the decade. Victorian fashion changed dramatically between the 1830s and the closing years of the century. In some periods, wide bell-shaped skirts dominated. In others, the volume moved backward into the bustle. At still other moments, skirts narrowed before expanding again with new arrangements of drapery and support. During the age of the crinoline, a cage-like structure of steel hoops replaced the need for many heavy petticoats. Earlier methods of creating volume had relied on layers of stiffened fabric, which could become warm and cumbersome. The steel cage was surprisingly light by comparison, and allowed air to circulate beneath the skirt. It also created practical difficulties. Doorways became negotiations. Chairs required careful approach. Crowded rooms demanded awareness of how much space the skirt occupied. A woman turning too quickly could disturb a table or brush against another gown. Contemporary caricaturists delighted in such possibilities. The humour was gentle enough in polite company, but the risks were real. Large skirts could come too close to fireplaces or candles, and highly flammable fabrics made open flame a genuine danger in 19th century homes. Some recorded accidents were severe enough to make fashionable dress a subject of public concern. Later, when the bustle replaced the wide crinoline, the skirt's volume shifted toward the back. Bustles came in many forms, from padded cushions to frameworks of steel or cane. They supported elaborate folds of fabric and allowed dressmakers to create impressive trains and draped overskirts. The front of the gown could remain comparatively narrow while the rear projected outward in a carefully engineered shape. Even now, historians continue to debate how comfortable different bustle designs truly were in ordinary use. Surviving advertisements often praised convenience, flexibility, and lightness. But advertisements rarely described the moments when a wire bent badly or a fastening came loose during a crowded evening. Over the supporting structure came petticoats. Some added volume, others softened the outline of the hoops or bustle so that their framework would not show through the outer skirt. A petticoat might be made from cotton, linen, silk, or more decorative materials depending on wealth and purpose. Flounces and stiffened hems could help the skirt stand correctly. The layers were not merely decorative. Each one controlled the layer above it. That principle had existed in clothing for centuries. Medieval noblewomen had also worn multiple garments, using linen beneath wool or silk, with belts, lacing, fur linings, and structured bodices creating fashionable silhouettes. Victorian dress was mechanically more elaborate, but the basic idea remained familiar. Visible elegance rested upon hidden construction. At last, the gown itself could be brought forward. The skirt might be put on separately from the bodice, depending on the design, hooks and eyes closed invisibly, ribbons tied at the waist. The maid checked that seams aligned and that decorative panels fell where the dressmaker intended. A bodice designed for evening wear exposed more of the shoulders and upper chest than most daytime clothing. This contrast was one of the curious features of Victorian respectability. During the day, modest fashion often covered the body heavily. At a formal evening ball, however, a low neckline and bare arms could become entirely acceptable, provided the wearer followed the correct social rules surrounding age, marital status, gloves, jewellery, and occasion. Some chroniclers complained about this apparent contradiction. Others treated it as completely ordinary. Fashion, as always, possessed its own logic. The maid moved around the wearer, gently pulling the skirt into place. A train might be lifted and allowed to fall again. Any wrinkles had to be smoothed. The bodice needed to remain secure during movement. Decorations had to sit evenly. Then came the final hidden adjustments. Small pads could correct the line of the figure. Dress shields placed beneath the arms helped protect expensive fabric from perspiration. These practical inserts were especially useful because ballroom dancing generated heat, and replacing a bodice was far more costly than changing a hidden protective layer. A pocket might also be concealed within the skirt. Victorian women did not always lack pockets. Despite the common assumption, some dresses incorporated them, while separate pockets tied around the waist had been common in earlier periods. By the later 19th century, internal pockets could hold a handkerchief or other small necessities, though elaborate evening gowns sometimes offered little convenient storage. That made the reticule, fan, and dance card all the more useful. As the layers accumulated, the woman's movement changed subtly. She had to remember the width and weight of her skirt. Sitting required care. Turning required awareness. Walking downstairs demanded patience, especially if a train followed behind. A practiced woman learned these movements from repetition. The gown was not something she merely wore, she learned how to inhabit it. By now, the bedroom had grown warmer from the fire and the activity of dressing. Candle flames trembled slightly when someone crossed the room. The scent of warmed fabric mixed with soap, powder, and faint perfume. Outside, night had settled completely. Carriage lamps passed below the window like small moving stars. Somewhere in the distance, a bell marked another hour, steady and unhurried. The city seemed to be drawing its curtains, even as fashionable houses were only beginning to awaken for the evening. In the mirror, the transformation was almost complete. The chemise and corset had disappeared beneath the bodice. Hoops or bustle had vanished beneath flowing fabric. Petticoats remained unseen. Every hidden layer had performed its work and then disappeared from notice. Only the finished silhouette remained. Yet the head and hands were still comparatively plain. Hair waited to be dressed. Jewellery remained locked away. Flowers had not yet been pinned into place. The fan lay folded, and the pale gloves still rested untouched in their box. The structure of the gown was ready. Now ornament could begin. With the gown finally settled into its proper shape, attention moved upward toward the face and hair, where some of the evening's most delicate work was still waiting. A Victorian ball gown might establish the silhouette, but hair, jewellery, flowers, and the small objects carried in the hands completed the impression. These finishing details often revealed almost as much about the wearer as the dress itself. Hair came first. For many fashionable women, evening hair was arranged with considerable care and usually with assistance. Long hair might be divided, twisted, braided, looped, rolled, or pinned into forms that changed greatly across the Victorian decades. Some styles gathered the hair low at the back of the head, others raised it higher or allowed curls to frame the face. Later fashions could become surprisingly architectural, with coils and waves arranged around combs, pads, or hairpieces. A lady's maid stood close behind the chair, working patiently. Hairpins accumulated between her fingers. Brushes and combs lay across the dressing table. A small mirror might be positioned so the woman could see the arrangement from behind, though much depended upon trust. Once the hairstyle became complicated enough, the wearer could no longer easily judge it without assistance. False hair was not unusual. Hairpieces, switches, and added curls helped create fashionable volume without demanding impossible quantities of natural hair. Human hair became an active trade, collected and sold through networks that stretched across Europe. Some women saved their own cut hair, while poorer women could sell theirs for money. No one can quite agree on how openly fashionable women discussed these additions. Etiquette encouraged the illusion that beauty was natural even when its construction involved pins, padding, powder, and another person's hair. Yet surviving advertisements make it clear that false hair was widely available. Hair also carried sentimental meanings. Locks of a loved one's hair could be preserved in brooches, rings, pendants, or small memorial objects. Hair jewellery became particularly associated with mourning, though it was not restricted entirely to grief. A tiny braid sealed beneath glass might preserve the memory of a relative for decades. For a ball, however, the mood was usually brighter. Decorative combs could be inserted once the hairstyle was secure. Tortoiseshell, carved materials, metalwork, pearls, or gemstones might ornament them. Small pins glittered where candlelight or gaslight reached the hair. Feathers could add height or movement, though they had to be positioned so carefully that they did not become an inconvenience during dancing. Fresh flowers were especially prized. Roses, violets, camellias, orange blossoms, and other seasonal flowers could be placed in the hair or along the bodice. A florist might prepare them shortly before the evening, and a maid kept them cool until the final moment. Flowers carried associations that Victorians loved to elaborate. Books explaining the supposed language of flowers became popular, assigning emotions and messages to different species and colours. A red rose might imply passionate love, while a violet could suggest modesty or faithfulness. Yet historians remain cautious about imagining that everyone at a ball interpreted bouquets according to a single universal code. Floral meanings varied between books, and many people probably chose flowers because they were beautiful, fashionable, or available. Still, the symbolism amused society. A hostess might plan floral decorations with great attention. A young woman might receive flowers before an event. A bloom pinned close to the dress could quietly attract notice, even when no secret message was intended. Jewellery came next. In wealthier households, valuable pieces were brought out carefully, sometimes from locked cases or safes. Diamonds were particularly suited to evening wear because they caught artificial light with remarkable brilliance. Pearls offered a softer glow, emeralds, rubies, sapphires, garnets, and opals provided richer colours, while gold settings warmed beneath candlelight. Family jewellery often carried histories invisible to other guests. A necklace might have belonged to a grandmother. Earrings could have been wedding gifts. A brooch might commemorate an inheritance or a marriage between families. Wearing such pieces was not merely decoration. It quietly displayed continuity, property, and belonging. Some jewels carried superstition with them. Opals, for instance, acquired a reputation for bad luck during parts of the 19th century, though this belief was inconsistent and may have been strengthened by literature and changing fashion. Queen Victoria herself admired opals and gave them as gifts, which did not entirely remove their mysterious reputation. Other stones were believed to protect health, strengthen affection, or reflect character. These beliefs were remnants of much older traditions. Medieval lapidaries had assigned spiritual and medicinal powers to gemstones, claiming that certain stones could guard against poison, preserve courage, or reveal deception. By the Victorian period, fashionable society did not necessarily accept such claims literally, but traces of the older symbolism remained remarkably persistent. Once the necklace and earrings were in place, a maid checked how they worked with the neckline. Too much jewellery could compete with an elaborate gown. Too little might leave a grand dress looking unfinished. Etiquette encouraged balance, though fashion frequently tested the limits of restraint. Then there was the fan. Few accessories were more closely associated with the ballroom. A folded fan could be held lightly in one gloved hand, opened during warm moments, rested against the wrist, or used to create a little privacy during conversation. Fans ranged from modestly decorated examples to extraordinary objects made with carved sticks, painted silk, lace, feathers, mother of pearl, and gilding. They were practical because ballrooms grew hot. Hundreds of candles or gas jets produced heat. So did crowded bodies. Heavy clothing trapped warmth. Dancing added still more. A fan was not merely decorative after several vigorous turns around the floor. There was also the famous idea of a secret language of fans. Later retellings sometimes describe an elaborate code in which every gesture communicated a precise romantic message. Holding a fan against the cheek supposedly meant one thing, opening it slowly another, dropping it yet another. The evidence is less tidy. Some fan gestures certainly became playful forms of flirtation, and manufacturers printed supposed fan languages for amusement. Yet even now, historians continue to debate whether these elaborate codes were widely followed, or were mostly novelty inventions promoted by advertisers. Whatever the truth, a fan gave the hands something graceful to do. Small objects mattered in formal society. A dance card might eventually hang from the wrist on a ribbon or decorative cord. A tiny pencil accompanied it. A handkerchief could be embroidered with initials. A reticule might contain smelling salts, coins, or other necessities. Smelling salts were especially common among people concerned about faintness. Strong ammonia-based preparations could sharply stimulate the senses. Fainting itself had many possible causes: heat, exhaustion, illness, emotional distress, tight clothing, or simply crowded rooms with poor ventilation. The fashionable image of delicate women fainting at every inconvenience was exaggerated, but smelling salts were real and practical objects found in many households. By now, the dressing table had become crowded. Open jewellery cases reflected the lamplight. Hairpins lay scattered beside combs. The scent of fresh flowers mingled with perfume and warmed beeswax. A maid collected discarded ribbons and returned unused ornaments to their boxes. Outside, the night had deepened. The windows showed little beyond the glow of street lamps and the occasional carriage passing below. Somewhere farther away, rain might patter lightly against slate roofs, while a church bell measured the hour with the same slow certainty that bells had marked time for generations. Within the room, the woman rose carefully from her chair. The gown settled around her, the necklace caught the light, flowers rested against the finished hair. The fan remained folded in one hand while the maid inspected the entire appearance from a few steps away, searching for a crooked ribbon, an uneven curl, or a clasp that had not fully fastened. For the first time that evening, she looked almost ready to leave. Elsewhere in the house, and however, another dressing room was still busy. Brushes moved across dark wool, razors waited beside warm water, white linen was being arranged, and a gentleman's own carefully restrained transformation was beginning. Elsewhere in the house, the preparation of a gentleman followed a quieter visual language. where a woman's evening dress might depend upon silk, flowers, lace, jewels, and carefully arranged colour, a gentleman was expected to display refinement through restraint. His clothing grew increasingly dark as the Victorian century advanced, and the effect was deliberate. Elegance rested not on abundance but on cut, cleanliness, proportion, and the difficult art of appearing perfectly prepared without seeming to have tried too hard. The dressing room itself might be warm from a coal fire burning steadily behind the grate. A washstand stood nearby with a basin, jug, soap dish, shaving brush, and folded towels. Brushes rested on a wooden dressing table. A mirror reflected the amber light of gas or candles, and across the back of a chair lay the evening clothes that a valet had already inspected. The valet's role could be essential in a wealthy household. He brushed coats, prepared linen, arranged shaving water, cleaned shoes, checked gloves, and made certain that no button, seam, or cuff betrayed neglect. He might also understand his employer's wardrobe better than the gentleman himself, knowing which waistcoat suited a particular coat or which pair of gloves had become too marked for a formal occasion. Some gentlemen dressed largely without assistance, of course. No one can quite agree on how dependent individual upper-class men were upon their valets. Household size, income, habit, military experience, travel, and personality all mattered. Etiquette books describe ideals, while diaries and letters reveal men who range from meticulous dressers to those who required considerable rescuing from their own indifference. For an important ball, however, very little could be left visibly careless. The evening began with washing and shaving. Warm water softened the beard, and shaving soap was worked into a lather using a brush. Straight razors required skill and regular maintenance. Their blades had to be sharpened and stropped properly, and a hurried hand could easily produce an inconvenient cut just when a gentleman wished to look composed. Facial hair changed dramatically throughout the Victorian period. In some decades, clean-shaven faces were fashionable. In others, whiskers, moustaches, and full beards became prominent symbols of masculine maturity. A man with a moustache might shape it with wax, while beard oils or pomades could soften and control facial hair. Hair on the head was combed neatly, sometimes with scented oil. Too much shine, however, risked appearing vulgar. Respectable evening grooming favoured polish without excess. The same principle applied to scent. A gentleman might use cologne or a lightly scented hair preparation, but etiquette usually discouraged strong perfume. The goal was freshness rather than a fragrance announcing his arrival before he entered the room. Clean linen carried even greater importance. The white shirt front, collar, cuffs, and tie formed sharp points of brightness against dark evening clothes. Because white fabric revealed every mark, laundering and starching had to be done carefully. Shirts could possess removable collars or cuffs, allowing the most visible portions to be washed and replaced separately. A well-laundered shirt was itself a small display of household efficiency. Behind its crisp surface stood boiling water, soap, starch, ironing, drying, and repeated labour, often performed by women in laundries or household service. In older centuries, linen had also signalled cleanliness and status because it could be washed more readily than heavy outer garments. The Victorian gentleman, immaculate beneath gaslight, still depended upon that ancient relationship between clean linen and respectable appearance. Over the shirt came the waistcoat. Earlier Victorian evening waistcoats sometimes offered more colour and pattern than later formal wear, though fashion gradually moved toward paler and more restrained styles for the grandest evening occasions. Silk, marcella, and other fine fabrics could be used, with carefully chosen buttons providing subtle decoration. The waistcoat had to fit smoothly. Any bunching beneath the coat disturbed the clean line expected of formal dress. Trousers followed similarly strict expectations. They were brushed, pressed, and checked for dust. Fashionable trousers changed in cut during the century, but for evening wear they generally became part of an increasingly sober, dark ensemble. The coat was the most important visible piece. Depending on the period and occasion, formal evening dress might involve a tailcoat with a cutaway front and long tails behind. Black gradually became dominant, though very dark blue also appeared earlier in the century. The shoulders had to sit naturally, the waist fit closely, and the sleeves revealed just the correct amount of white cuff. Tailoring was judged by small proportions, A coat that was expensive but badly fitted could look inferior to one of simpler cloth cut by a skilled tailor. Tailors therefore possessed a quiet authority over fashionable men. Measurements were taken carefully. Cloth was shaped to the body. Padding could refine the chest or shoulders. Hand-stitching gave structure that was largely invisible once the garment was finished. Even now, historians continue to debate how much padding and shaping ordinary fashionable men used, because surviving garments differ and satirical illustrations often exaggerate. What is certain is that masculine clothing was no more natural than women's fashion. It simply concealed its architecture more effectively. Then came the tie. For formal evening wear in the later 19th century, the white bow tie became increasingly standard. Earlier decades allowed different neckcloth arrangements, but all required attention. A poorly tied cravat or bow could spoil the entire effect. The valet might assist, but some men took pride in tying their own. The knot had to appear neat without looking mechanical. Several attempts might be required. One tie could be discarded for another if a crease refused to cooperate. There was a gentle irony in a society that prized masculine simplicity, while allowing a man to spend several minutes studying a strip of white cloth in the mirror. The shoes waited below. Black evening shoes were cleaned until they shone. Leather polish, brushes, cloths, and patient buffing produced the smooth surface expected in a ballroom. Any mud from daytime streets had already been removed. Evening shoes belonged to polished floors, not to the wet pavement outside. A gentleman rarely walked far to a formal ball if his household could provide a carriage. Gloves completed another important part of the ensemble. Pale or white gloves protected against direct skin contact during dancing and reflected contemporary ideals of formality. They needed to be spotless. A gentleman could carry a spare pair because gloves might become damp or soiled over the course of the evening. The hands beneath them were expected to be clean and well kept. Nails were trimmed, rings were generally restrained, a signet ring might appear, and a watch remained one of the most characteristic gentleman's accessories. A pocket watch, sometimes connected to the waistcoat by a chain, provided both practical utility and quiet display. The chain might carry a seal, key, or small fob. Earlier generations had attached protective charms, relics, or tokens to belts and chains, and while Victorian watch ornaments were usually secular, the habit of keeping meaningful small objects close to the body had very old roots. Some men carried family seals, others carried miniature portraits, locks of hair, or small memorial pieces hidden from public view. A handkerchief was placed in a pocket. Calling cards might be carried if needed. A hat and overcoat waited for the journey. In winter, a heavy coat lined with warm material protected the far lighter clothing beneath. The transformation was nearly complete. The gentleman stood before the mirror while the valet gave the coat a final brush. A stray thread vanished. A cuff was adjusted. The tie was corrected almost imperceptibly. Downstairs, somewhere beyond the closed door, household bells rang softly as servants answered requests from other rooms. The kitchen fire burned on. In the entrance hall, the smell of polished wood and coal smoke mixed with the cooler air slipping beneath the heavy front door. Outside, the street had grown black and shining after rain. Gas lamps formed pools of yellow light along the pavement. Carriage wheels passed at intervals, followed by the rhythmic sound of horses' hooves. Farther away, a church clock began striking another hour, slow and measured above the roofs. The gentleman checked his watch. There was still time. His dark coat was smooth, his linen bright, his gloves untouched, his shoes polished, and his hat waiting below. From a distance, the preparation might appear almost effortless. Yet throughout the house, servants had spent hours making effortless appearances possible. And as the family drew closer to departure, those servants now had their own complicated sequence of duties to complete before the carriage could finally leave the quiet street behind. While the family upstairs approached the final stages of dressing, the rest of the house seemed to become quietly more active. Doors opened and closed along corridors, footsteps crossed back stairs, bells trembled on the servants' board, fires were checked, lamps filled, brushes put away, and small last-minute requests carried from one room to another. The household was preparing not only the people who would attend the ball, but also the rooms they would leave behind and the arrangements that would carry them safely through the night. For domestic servants, an evening engagement could alter the rhythm of an entire day. A lady's maid might already have spent hours working with gowns, hair, jewellery, gloves, and accessories. A valet had brushed coats, prepared shaving water, polished shoes, and inspected evening linen. Yet their duties did not simply end when their employers appeared fully dressed. They remained responsible for small emergencies until the moment of departure, and often long after. A ribbon could suddenly loosen, a glove might reveal a mark unnoticed earlier, a gentleman could decide that one waistcoat looked wrong beneath the light in the entrance hall and request another. A woman might discover that a bracelet clasp caught against the lace on her sleeve. Flowers placed in her hair could begin to droop in an overheated room. Such problems required calm hands. The most experienced servants understood that fashionable preparation involved preventing difficulties before their employers noticed them. Elsewhere, housemaids attended to the rooms themselves. A dressing room used for several hours might contain used towels, basins of cooling water, discarded pins, pieces of thread, opened boxes, brushes, bottles, and garments temporarily placed across chairs. A maid restored order carefully, but valuable jewellery or clothing could not simply be gathered without thought. Items had particular places, and wealthy employers might be extremely particular about them. The fire was another responsibility. On a cold night, bedroom fires could not simply be allowed to die while the family was away. Some rooms needed enough heat to remain comfortable for the return in the early hours of the morning. Coal might be added before departure, with arrangements made for a servant to check the grate later. Fire management was one of the oldest rhythms of household life. Centuries before Victorian London, servants in manor houses and castle halls had risen early to revive embers beneath ash, carry wood through cold passages, and keep flames alive through winter evenings. Victorian servants worked with coal grates rather than great medieval hearths, but the principle remained familiar. Warmth required attention, fuel, soot, and someone willing to perform the work. In the entrance hall, another servant might inspect outer garments. Heavy evening cloaks were arranged where they could be reached without delay. A woman's cloak needed to cover the gown without crushing its decorations. Fur or velvet collars were turned properly. A shawl might be kept close at hand in case the carriage proved colder than expected. Gentlemen's overcoats and hats waited nearby. The hall itself had been swept and tidied, though its floor would soon receive damp footprints from the pavement. Umbrellas stood ready if rain threatened. In winter, the opening of the front door could send a sharp current of air through the house, carrying with it the smell of wet stone, horse traffic, and smoke from neighbouring chimneys. Outside, the coachman had his own preparations. The family carriage needed to be clean enough for a formal evening. Lamps were checked and lit, harness was inspected, leather straps, buckles, wheels, and fittings had to be sound. Horses were groomed and harnessed, their coats brushed and their hooves examined before they were brought from the stable. A carriage journey through London after dark could involve crowded streets. The coachman needed experience, patience, and knowledge of the city. He had to judge traffic around theatres, hotels, private houses, and fashionable squares where many carriages might converge at roughly the same hour. A footman could accompany the carriage, sometimes standing or sitting outside depending on the vehicle and household custom. At the destination, he might descend quickly, open the carriage door, assist passengers, and help communicate with the servants of the host. Formal arrival depended upon these practiced movements. The family stepped into the light. The servants managed everything around them. No one can quite agree on how smoothly this machinery worked in every grand household. Memoirs sometimes describe servants as almost invisible figures performing their duties without error, while household records reveal constant problems of illness, shortages, quarrels, broken equipment, late deliveries, and staff turnover. The ideal of perfect domestic service was partly an illusion. Real houses contained tired people. A kitchen maid might have been awake since before dawn. A housemaid could have climbed the stairs dozens of times. A footman might still have several hours of work ahead. A coachman waiting outside a ball could remain exposed to cold weather long after the guests inside had forgotten about the streets altogether. Before departure, some households offered a light meal or refreshments to servants whose duties would continue late into the night. Bread, cheese, cold meat, tea, or leftovers from earlier meals might be available depending on the house. Servants' meals were structured around work rather than fashionable hours. While the family might eventually eat an elaborate supper after midnight, those who enabled the evening often needed something simpler before the carriage left. The servants' hall provided its own world. It was generally plainer than the family dining room, with sturdy wooden furniture designed for use rather than display. A long table could bear the marks of many meals. Chairs were practical. Crockery was less delicate. The atmosphere could be warmer and less formal than upstairs, though hierarchy existed here too. The butler stood at the top of the male domestic structure in many large houses. The housekeeper held corresponding authority among female servants. Below them were footmen, valets, ladies' maids, cooks, housemaids, kitchen maids, scullery maids, and others whose exact positions varied according to the size and wealth of the household. Status determined privileges. A senior servant might enjoy greater privacy or better food. Junior servants carried heavier physical burdens. Some positions were so exhausting that turnover was frequent. Household bells reinforced these divisions. A board of bells, each connected by wires to a particular room, allowed members of the family to summon servants without walking through the house. Each bell had a distinctive movement or label, and experienced staff learned to recognize which room required attention. The mechanism looked modern beside the bell ropes of earlier houses, yet its purpose was ancient. Someone waited to be called. When the bell sounded, someone moved. On the evening of a ball, the bells might become especially active. A maid was summoned for a missing handkerchief. A valet returned to adjust a collar. A servant carried a message downstairs that the family would be ready in 10 minutes. Then another message that departure had been delayed. Time in a fashionable household often moved in such small corrections. The coachman could be ready while someone upstairs still debated jewellery. The footman could stand waiting beside the door while a torn glove was replaced. There was little room for visible impatience. One lesser-known practice concerned the careful protection of carriage interiors from evening clothing. Long trains, pale fabrics, and delicate shoes could easily be damaged by mud carried inside from previous journeys. Servants brushed the carriage, checked rugs, and made certain the interior was clean before the family entered. In poor weather, additional coverings could be used. Mud was an ordinary feature of 19th century streets, just as it had been on the roads leading to medieval villages, monasteries, and market towns. Elegant clothing depended upon keeping that mud at a distance. At last, the household settled into a brief moment of expectancy. The front hall glowed beneath lamps. A footman stood near the door. The carriage waited outside, its lamps burning through the damp night. Horses shifted gently in their harness, sending a faint metallic sound through the quiet street. Upstairs, the final boxes had been closed. The lady's maid checked the gown one last time. The valet lifted the gentleman's overcoat, somewhere deeper in the house. The kitchen fire crackled beneath iron cookware, and a clock measured the remaining minutes with steady little beats. The family was nearly ready to descend. But before the carriage could carry them toward the ballroom, there remained one more invisible preparation, the rules of behaviour already settled in their minds. The names to remember, the people to greet, the introductions to seek, and the mistakes that polite society expected them carefully to avoid. Before anyone stepped into the waiting carriage, there was another kind of preparation that could not be pressed, polished, stitched, or fastened. It existed instead in memory and habit, the quiet knowledge of how one was expected to behave once the front door of the host's house opened. Victorian high society was governed by rules that were rarely written down in full, because many of the people who moved within that world had learned them gradually from childhood. A successful evening depended not only on wearing the correct clothes, but on knowing when to arrive, whom to acknowledge, how to speak, when to remain silent, and how to move through a crowded room without appearing either too eager or too distant. In the entrance hall, while servants arranged cloaks and the carriage waited outside, members of the family might quietly confirm practical details. The address was already known. The hour had been noted. The names of the host and hostess were familiar. Yet a large ball could include hundreds of guests, some well known, some barely remembered, and others whose importance came from family connections rather than personal acquaintance. A mother accompanying an unmarried daughter might remind her of someone she would be expected to greet. A gentleman might be told that a particular family had recently returned to London. A younger guest could be quietly warned against ignoring an elderly relative whose presence at the ball might otherwise seem unimportant. These reminders were part of a social map, almost as detailed as the streets through which the carriage would travel. Introductions mattered greatly. A person could not always simply approach a stranger and begin a conversation, particularly where unmarried young women were concerned. Proper introductions helped establish that both parties belonged within an acceptable social network. A hostess, relative, or mutual acquaintance might perform this small but important service. Once introduced, conversation could begin, but conversation itself came with boundaries. Religion and politics could become uncomfortable if handled too forcefully. Personal questions about income or private affairs were generally avoided. Gossip, though widespread, was expected to wear a respectable disguise. The most skillful conversationalist could discuss acquaintances, marriages, travel, music, theatres, weather, horses, and society news without openly appearing malicious. The distinction was delicate. Victorian etiquette praised kindness and restraint, even in rooms where reputation could be damaged by a few sentences spoken beneath a chandelier. Some etiquette writers warned against talking too much. Others warned against remaining silent. No one can quite agree on how successfully real ballroom guests balance these instructions, and private letters suggest that awkward conversations were as common then as they are in any age. Even the most polished society contained shy young men, distracted hostesses, nervous debutantes, tedious storytellers, and people who forgot names at precisely the wrong moment. The dance itself required additional rules. A gentleman usually asked a woman for a dance rather than assuming her participation. If she accepted, the dance could be recorded on her card. Refusing one gentleman and then immediately dancing the same dance with another might cause offence unless there was a clear reason. A young unmarried woman was often accompanied by a mother, married relative, or other chaperone. The chaperone's role was not simply to sit in a chair and watch the room. She helped manage introductions, observed behaviour, discouraged overly familiar attention, and quietly guided the younger woman through the evening. The system could be restrictive, but it also provided structure in an environment where reputations mattered enormously. A young woman who danced repeatedly with the same man might attract comment. Whether those comments were approving depended on circumstances. If the families welcomed the connection, repeated dances might seem encouraging. If they did not, this same pattern could become a source of whispered concern. The rules were rarely as precise as later summaries sometimes suggest. Some chroniclers claimed that 2 dances with the same partner represented noticeable interest, while others describe evenings in which familiar couples danced together more freely. Fashion, decade, family, and location all shaped what was considered proper. Even now, historians continue to debate how rigidly dance etiquette operated outside the most formal circles. The dance card helped impose order. Small and often decorative, it might list the dances planned for the evening, with spaces where a gentleman's name could be written. A tiny pencil hung from a cord beside it. Some cards were simple pieces of stiff paper. Others became elaborate souvenirs decorated with silk, metalwork, embossing, or imagery chosen to match the occasion. To a young woman, the card could become a record of the evening before much of the evening had even happened. A line filled with names suggested a busy night. Empty spaces could feel more noticeable. Yet the card was not merely romantic. It helped prevent confusion when several partners had been promised dances hours in advance. Punctuality created its own complication. Dinner parties generally demanded greater precision, while balls could tolerate later arrival. Large fashionable gatherings often continued deep into the night, and guests did not necessarily appear at the stated opening hour. Still, arriving absurdly late could create inconvenience or seem affected. Arriving too early could be equally awkward, because the host's rooms might not yet have reached the lively fullness that made a large ball comfortable. Fashionable society therefore developed a strange relationship with time. Clocks were consulted carefully so that people could avoid looking as though they had consulted them carefully. The habit would have amused earlier generations. Medieval noble households had also lived by systems of rank and ritual, though their hours were marked less by pocket watches than by bells from churches, abbeys, and monasteries. A bell for prayer could carry over winter fields or muddy roads, telling villagers and travellers alike that another portion of the day had passed. Victorian London had clocks everywhere, yet the principle remained familiar. Social life depended upon arriving at the proper moment. Calling cards also belonged to this invisible network. A gentleman's or lady's card carried a printed name, sometimes with an address or title. Cards could be left during formal calls and helped indicate who had visited even when the person being called upon was not at home. They were small objects with large social consequences. The handling of corners or markings on calling cards has sometimes been described as a complete coded language, with different folds supposedly communicating precise messages. Some such customs did exist, but later retellings often make them more systematic than surviving evidence supports. As with the language of fans, Victorian society delighted in the possibility that tiny gestures could carry hidden meaning. In practice, the broader purpose was simpler. A calling card acknowledged connection. It said, in effect, that one household recognised another. Before attending a ball, families might already have exchanged visits or cards with the hosts. Social acceptance was built through repeated gestures rather than a single invitation. There were rules for greetings as well. Upon arrival, guests usually greeted the host and hostess rather than disappearing immediately into the ballroom. A gentleman removed his hat and outer garments. A woman's cloak was taken away, revealing the gown carefully protected during the journey. Bowing and curtsying had become less elaborate than in earlier centuries, but courteous physical gestures remained part of formal life. Handshakes were governed by familiarity and convention. A gentleman did not seize the hand of every woman he encountered. A woman could determine whether such familiarity was appropriate by offering her hand. These details might seem exhausting when written one after another. In reality, people who had spent their lives within the system often moved through them almost automatically. A child raised in an upper-class household learned by observation. She watched her mother receive callers. He watched his father greet acquaintances. Lessons in dancing, posture, and manners began long before the first important ball. Even the way a person entered a room could be trained. Standing too stiffly suggested discomfort. Moving too quickly seemed hurried. Looking around too obviously could imply that one was searching for someone more important than the person currently speaking. Good manners required attention disguised as ease. There was also the old protective layer of superstition beneath formal etiquette. Some guests avoided wearing particular stones believed unlucky. Others carried small sentimental objects beneath clothing. A charm, miniature portrait, lock of hair, or family token might remain unseen through the entire evening. Such practices had roots far older than Victorian drawing rooms. Medieval travellers had carried pilgrim badges and touched saints' relics before dangerous journeys. Victorian aristocrats travelling only a few streets to a ballroom lived in a different world. But human beings had not entirely surrendered the desire to carry something reassuring into uncertain places, and a ballroom, socially speaking, could be uncertain indeed. An invitation might lead to friendship. A dance might begin an attachment. A careless remark could travel through several households before breakfast. A young woman could discover that the person she hoped to meet had not come at all. A gentleman might spend the night searching for an introduction that never occurred, yet outwardly, everyone was expected to remain composed. By now, the family had gathered near the entrance hall. The ladies' cloaks were ready. The gentlemen's hats and gloves waited close at hand. Servants moved with slightly greater speed, though without visible disorder. Outside, the horses shifted beneath their harness, and carriage lamps cast a warm glow onto the damp street. Somewhere beyond the rooftops, a clock struck the hour slowly. One stroke followed another. Inside, a final glance might pass between mother and daughter, husband and wife, host-bound siblings, or a gentleman and his valet. There was still a little time before departure, enough for something light to eat, enough for a cup of tea or a small glass of wine, enough to prevent an empty stomach from becoming troublesome after several hours of dancing. And so, before the front door opened and the cold night air entered the hall, the household turned briefly toward the dining room and the restrained little meal that would carry them comfortably toward midnight. Before the family finally stepped out into the night, there was often one last pause around the dining table. It was not the grand supper of the ball itself, nor was it meant to be a heavy meal. Rather, it was something quieter and more practical, enough food and drink to carry the body comfortably through a long evening of standing, conversation, dancing, and waiting beneath chandeliers until well past midnight. For many fashionable households, dinner had already been served earlier in the evening. Depending on the hour of the ball, guests might have eaten a proper meal at home before beginning their preparations, while others took only a lighter refreshment shortly before departure. social schedules varied greatly, and no one can quite agree on a single routine that every upper-class family followed. Diaries, household accounts, and etiquette books reveal a range of habits shaped by time, appetite, custom, and the particular occasion. What mattered was moderation. A guest who ate too heavily could find dancing uncomfortable. A guest who ate almost nothing might become faint or exhausted long before supper was served at the host's house. The solution was often a restrained meal. Cold meats might appear on the sideboard, sliced thinly and served without elaborate ceremony. Chicken, ham, tongue, or game could be offered alongside bread and butter. Cheese might be present, small savoury dishes, eggs, or light soups appeared in some households, while others preferred sandwiches or simple portions from food prepared earlier in the day. The exact choice depended on wealth and habit. A large Victorian house could maintain a remarkably complex food system. The kitchen range had been burning since morning. Servants had prepared breakfast, luncheon, tea, and perhaps dinner already, while still attending to the later needs of the household. Food did not appear effortlessly on the dining room table. It travelled through a chain of work. Vegetables were washed and trimmed, meat was roasted, boiled, or kept cold. Bread arrived from a baker or was prepared within the household. Silver had to be cleaned, glassware had to be inspected, linen was washed, starched, folded, and laid smoothly beneath dishes. Even a small pre-ball meal rested upon many hours of labour. The family, however, encountered only the finished surface. The dining room might be warmly lit, with the curtains drawn against the dark street. A coal fire burned in the grate if the season demanded it. Lamps or candles illuminated polished wood and silver, creating small reflections that trembled when someone moved around the table. The atmosphere was generally less ceremonious than at a formal dinner. There was little reason to linger over several courses when departure waited. A woman already dressed in an elaborate gown had to eat carefully. A splash of sauce or a crumb of dark food could undo hours of preparation. Wide skirts and trains also made sitting at the table more complicated than usual. The gown demanded awareness even during a quiet meal. A chair was approached carefully. The skirt was arranged so it would not crush awkwardly beneath the wearer. The train, if present, needed to fall safely behind or to one side. A maid might remain nearby in case anything required attention before departure. Gloves were usually not yet worn while eating. They remained clean and waiting for the final moment. Tea was an obvious choice for some households. By the Victorian period, tea had become deeply woven into British domestic life, and a small cup before leaving could provide warmth and familiarity. Yet too much liquid before a long carriage ride and several hours in crowded rooms was not always desirable, especially when access to convenient facilities away from home could be uncertain. Coffee might also appear. Wine, sherry, or another modest alcoholic drink could be taken by adults, though etiquette strongly discouraged obvious intoxication before entering society. Champagne belonged more naturally to the ball itself. Water was available, of course, though 19th century urban concerns about water quality meant that habits varied by household and location. Wealthier London homes increasingly benefited from improving water systems during the century, but confidence in municipal supplies did not develop evenly. This small meal could also serve another purpose. It slowed everyone down. After hours of dressing, fastening, calling for servants, checking jewellery, replacing gloves, and consulting clocks, sitting briefly at the table restored something close to ordinary household rhythm. Conversation might remain practical. The family could confirm the planned time of departure. Someone might ask whether the carriage had been brought around. A mother could remind her daughter not to exhaust herself during the first dances. A gentleman might glance at his watch and calculate how long the journey would take. There was no need for urgency yet. Victorian balls usually began late enough that fashionable families did not race from home at sunset. Depending on the event, guests might arrive near 10 or 11 in the evening, with dancing continuing into the early morning. Supper could come after midnight. For younger guests attending one of their first major balls, such hours alone could feel extraordinary. Their ordinary days were structured by meals, calls, lessons, walks, and household routines. Now the night itself was becoming social territory. This reversal of the usual rhythm had older precedents. Medieval aristocratic feasts could also extend deep into the evening, though most ordinary people rose and slept according to daylight, season, labour, and bells. In monasteries, the night was interrupted by prayer, In villages, firelight and rushlights shaped the hours after dark. The Victorian ballroom belonged to a world of gaslight, coal, clocks, and carriages. Yet it shared something with those earlier candlelit halls. A special evening could suspend the ordinary boundaries of the day. Food also carried small traditions and superstitions. Some people avoided particular dishes before important social occasions simply because they believed them difficult to digest. Others trusted familiar remedies for an unsettled stomach. Peppermint, ginger, chamomile, or other herbal preparations had long histories in domestic medicine. Victorian households inherited a vast mixture of folk remedies and newer commercial medicines. A woman prone to headaches might keep smelling salts or a vinaigrette close at hand. A gentleman troubled by indigestion could reach for bicarbonate preparations, bitters, or patent remedies whose advertisements promised relief from almost every discomfort known to civilized life. Some were useful, others were little more than flavoured hope in an attractive bottle. Even now, historians continue to debate how heavily upper-class households relied upon commercial patent medicines compared with family remedies and professional physicians. Surviving advertisements make them appear everywhere, but advertisements were designed to create desire as much as reflect actual use. For an evening ball, however, prevention was preferable to treatment. A sensible meal offered the best beginning. A little bread, a slice of cold chicken, perhaps some fruit. Tea taken slowly. Nothing that threatened the pale satin bodice or left an awkward scent on the breath. Once the plates were cleared, the household began moving again. Servants entered quietly and removed dishes. The butler might receive word from the footman that the carriage stood ready. The coachman had already taken his place outside. Horses waited beneath the lamps, their breath faintly visible in colder weather. Upstairs, a lady's maid performed one final inspection before the cloak was fastened around the gown. Jewellery remained secure. Flowers still sat properly in the hair. The fan was taken up. The dance card was ready. A tiny handkerchief disappeared into a reticule or hidden pocket. Downstairs, the gentleman pulled on pale gloves only at the proper moment, careful not to mark them against anything dark or dusty. Their hats waited in the hall. Overcoats were lifted from hooks by servants. The household clock sounded softly. Outside, the night pressed close against the windows. A little rain may have fallen earlier, leaving the pavement dark and reflective beneath the gas lamps. Carriage wheels passed occasionally, each one suggesting another household somewhere nearby making the same slow journey toward music and light. For a moment, the dining room stood almost empty. The fire settled lower. A cup remained with a faint trace of tea at its bottom. A servant folded a napkin and carried it away. The family had eaten enough. The house had done everything it could to prepare them. Now the front door could open, cool air would enter, the polished evening shoes would remain safely above the wet street. And the carefully dressed guests, wrapped in cloaks and guided by footmen, would step into the carriage that waited to carry them through the gaslit city. The front door opened at last, and the calm warmth of the house gave way to the cool, damp air of the street. For all the hours spent arranging silk hair, gloves, jewels, and polished shoes, the journey to the ball remained a practical challenge. Victorian evening dress had been designed for drawing rooms and polished floors, not for gutters, mud, rain, or the unpredictable movement of horses. The carriage therefore became more than transportation. It was a small moving chamber that protected elegance from the city outside. A footman descended the steps first. He checked the pavement, held the door, and helped manage the ladies' cloaks and skirts as they approached the carriage. A long train could not simply be allowed to drag behind. It had to be lifted carefully, gathered without crushing its trimming, and guided inside in a way that left enough room for the wearer to sit. The process required practice. A woman might place one gloved hand lightly against the carriage frame while the footman offered support. The hoops or bustle beneath the gown altered the way she entered. Turning too quickly could catch fabric against the door. Sitting too abruptly might bend part of the supporting structure. Once inside, she arranged the skirt around herself as well as the confined space allowed. The gentleman followed. His dark coat was mostly concealed beneath a heavier overcoat, and his formal hat was handled carefully. The door closed, shutting out much of the street noise, though the creak of leather harness and the movement of the horses remained close. Outside, the coachman gathered the reins. A spoken command sent the horses forward, and the carriage rolled away from the house. The city changed immediately when seen through carriage glass at night. Rows of buildings appeared and vanished in sections of yellow light. Gas lamps illuminated wet pavements, doorways, iron railings, and the pale edges of fog. Shop windows that had been bright during the day stood dark behind shutters, while theatres, clubs, restaurants, and private houses remained active. London after dark was never completely silent. Horses were everywhere. Hooves struck stone and wood, paving with steady rhythm. Wheels rattled across uneven surfaces. Cab drivers called to one another. Somewhere farther down a street, a cart moved slowly with the heavy sound of iron-rimmed wheels. The carriage interior softened much of this. Upholstered seats absorbed movement. Rugs could be spread across the passengers' knees in colder weather. Small lamps outside the vehicle threw an occasional glow across the window. The effect could feel strangely private. Inside sat people dressed for display. Outside moved the vast ordinary city. The coachman carried a responsibility for both worlds. Driving at night required close attention. Street lighting had improved considerably during the Victorian period, but illumination remained uneven. Fog could reduce visibility sharply. Rain made roads slick. Other vehicles might suddenly emerge from side streets. No one can quite agree on whether fashionable London traffic was most difficult before or after the major street improvements of the 19th century. Contemporary complaints suggest that congestion remained a constant feature of busy districts, regardless of how many roads were widened or reorganised. On nights when several major balls, dinners, and theatrical performances ended at similar hours, carriage traffic could become especially dense. Outside a great house, vehicles sometimes queued for a remarkable distance. Coachmen waited their turn while footmen listened for names and watched for instructions. Horses shifted in their traces, stamping against the road. Lamps burned in long rows, and the smell of damp leather, smoke, manure, and rain gathered beneath the elegant facades. To the guests inside, much of this remained hidden. A woman might look through the glass and recognise familiar streets. The gentleman opposite could check his pocket watch. Conversation often remained light because the journey itself was a pause between two different social environments. The family had left behind the private world of preparation, but had not yet entered the public world of the ballroom. This interval could be useful. A young woman attending an important ball might steady herself after the intensity of dressing. A mother could quietly remind her of a name. A gentleman might review which acquaintances he hoped to greet. Outside, the coachman worried about something more immediate, avoiding a collision. Traffic rules were less standardized than modern drivers would expect. Vehicles generally followed established conventions, but crowded intersections relied heavily on judgment, experience, and mutual awareness. Carriage lamps helped after dark, yet fog could turn even bright lamps into blurred circles. Horses themselves added uncertainty. Most were well trained, but they remained animals capable of shying at sudden noise, slipping on wet streets, or reacting to another horse. Skilled coachmen learned to read changes in posture and movement through the reins. In winter, the cold created further problems. The passengers could wrap themselves in cloaks, but the coachmen sat exposed. Heavy coats, capes, gloves, and hats offered protection, yet hours spent waiting outside fashionable houses could become unpleasant. Footmen faced similar conditions. Their formal liveries were designed partly to display the status of the household rather than to maximize comfort. A wealthy family's servants might wear distinctive coats, buttons, hats, and colours. The practice had deep roots. Medieval and early modern noble households also clothed servants and retainers in recognizable livery, creating a visible sign of allegiance. In castle courtyards or along muddy pilgrimage roads, clothing could announce which lord or household a person served. Victorian liveried footmen belonged to a newer city, but the social meaning remained surprisingly old. The journey also preserved delicate clothing from one of the greatest enemies of 19th century elegance, mud. Even in improved parts of London, streets could become filthy after rain. Horse traffic added its own unpleasant layer to the road surface. A pale satin shoe could be ruined before reaching the host's door if its wearer had to walk even a short distance through such conditions. Carriages allowed guests to travel almost directly from one entrance to another. Where weather was severe, servants might place boards, mats, or coverings to create a cleaner path from carriage step to doorway. Umbrellas appeared when necessary, though managing one beside an elaborate gown was not always graceful. There were also special protective garments. Women could wear overshoes or protective boots during ordinary travel, but evening arrivals demanded careful planning so that practical coverings could be removed without disturbing the finished appearance. Cloaks were arranged broadly around the body, often concealing almost every trace of the gown beneath. In the darkness of the carriage, the splendid dress temporarily disappeared. Only a flash of jewellery or pale glove might catch the light. The flowers in the hair had to survive the journey too. Fresh blossoms could suffer from cold air, heat, or accidental pressure beneath a cloak. A maid therefore pinned them carefully before departure, knowing that replacing them after arrival might be impossible. Some women carried small bottles of scent or vinaigrettes. Others kept smelling salts nearby in case the confined air, corsetry, or nervousness produced discomfort. There was an old belief that certain fragrances could strengthen the nerves. Lavender, rosemary, mint, and aromatic vinegars had been used for generations as restorative scents. Medieval travellers sometimes carried herbs or scented materials against foul air, believing that unpleasant smells themselves could carry disease. Victorian medical understanding had changed, yet the habit of trusting strong fragrance as a source of relief had not entirely vanished. Even now, historians continue to debate how much ordinary people believe traditional ideas about scent after newer theories of disease began spreading through the 19th century. The carriage turned into a broader street. Ahead, the number of vehicles increased. This was one of the clearest signs that they were approaching the fashionable district where the ball was being held. Lamps appeared more frequently. Carriages moved in the same direction. Through one window, a woman might glimpse another vehicle containing pale faces, white shirt fronts, and the glimmer of jewels. The guests were converging. There was no need to ask where everyone was going. The road itself gave the answer. Traffic slowed. The horses reduced their pace, and the carriage joined a line extending toward a brilliantly lit townhouse. Windows high above the street glowed with extraordinary brightness. Curtains had been drawn back. Silhouettes moved behind the glass. Music could not yet be clearly heard, but the house seemed alive. Footmen stood beneath the entrance lamps. Servants moved between waiting vehicles. Names were called. Carriage doors opened and closed. A lady's heart might beat a little faster here, though her face was expected to remain composed. The journey had provided a quiet enclosure, a few minutes of darkness between home and society. Now that darkness was ending, the carriage advanced another few yards. Outside, rainwater shone beneath the lamps. The coachman brought the horses carefully forward. The footman prepared to descend. And as the vehicle finally reached the bright entrance, the door opened onto light, movement, polished stone, waiting servants, and the first unmistakable sounds of a ballroom already filling for the night. The carriage door opened beneath a wash of warm light, and for the first time that evening the carefully prepared guests stepped fully into the public world of the ball. The transition could feel almost theatrical, although nothing about it was meant to appear theatrical. A few moments earlier they had been enclosed within a dark carriage, surrounded by the muffled sounds of wheels and horses. Now they stood beneath lamps, among servants, polished stone, bright windows, and the steady arrival of other families dressed with equal care. A footman offered assistance as the ladies descended. The long skirt had to clear the carriage step. A train was lifted slightly. The cloak remained closed against the cold until the wearer had crossed safely into the entrance hall. Behind them, another carriage already waited to move forward. There was little time to linger outside. The coachman guided the horses away, allowing the next vehicle to approach. Footmen worked quickly because a grand ball could create a continuous stream of arrivals for an hour or more. Inside, the atmosphere changed at once. The entrance hall of a prosperous townhouse or country mansion might be brilliantly illuminated. Lamps and candles reflected from mirrors, polished brass, marble, painted ceilings, and glossy wood. Flowers could be arranged along staircases or clustered in large urns. Rugs softened footsteps, while servants directed arriving guests toward cloakrooms and receiving rooms. The outer garments came off. This simple act revealed a transformation that had taken hours to create. A dark cloak opened, and beneath it appeared pale silk, satin, lace, flowers, jewels, and the carefully shaped line of the evening gown. A gentleman surrendered his overcoat and hat, leaving the dark formal coat and bright white shirt front exposed. Servants received these garments and organized them so they could be found again hours later. This was more difficult than it sounds. A large ball might bring hundreds of cloaks, coats, hats, wraps, umbrellas, and overshoes into the house. Labels, memory, attendance, and established routines helped prevent confusion. No one can quite agree on how often fashionable evenings ended with the wrong cloak being carried downstairs, but memoirs and comic accounts suggest that cloakroom mistakes were far from unknown. A lady might also take this moment to make a final adjustment. Her maid had remained at home in many cases, so there was no familiar hand nearby to repair a loose curl or twisted ribbon. A mirror became useful, gloves were checked, a flower was gently repositioned. A skirt that had been crushed slightly in the carriage could be smoothed. Then came the receiving line. The host and hostess stood where arriving guests could greet them before entering the main rooms. Their task was demanding. They might repeat courteous greetings dozens or even hundreds of times while remembering names, family connections, recent illnesses, engagements, marriages, and visitors from abroad. The best hosts made such recognition appear natural. A guest approached. There was a bow, a slight curtsy, or another appropriate greeting depending on the relationship and period. A few words followed. Then the guest moved onward so the next arrival could be received. The ritual had much older echoes. In medieval halls, visiting nobles were also received according to rank and household custom. Guests passed beneath stone arches and through guarded doors before entering candlelit chambers where position mattered deeply. The Victorian townhouse was warmer, brighter, and more comfortable than most medieval castles, yet formal hospitality still depended upon knowing who stood where and who acknowledged whom. Beyond the receiving area, the ballroom opened into light. The first impression could be overwhelming even to someone accustomed to fashionable society. Chandeliers hung overhead, carrying candles, gas jets, or combinations of illumination depending on the house and decade. Mirrors multiplied the light until the room seemed larger and brighter than its actual dimensions. Gilded frames, pale walls, polished floors, flowers, and fabrics reflected warmth in every direction. The floor itself had been prepared carefully. Servants might spend hours cleaning and polishing it so dancers could move smoothly. Too much wax could make it dangerously slippery. Too little left the surface dull or resistant. Some hosts hired specialists to prepare floors. A ballroom floor needed to offer just enough glide. The musicians occupied a raised area or one end of the room. Depending on the size of the occasion, the ensemble might include strings, winds, brass, and other instruments capable of filling a large space with dance music. The sound was lively enough for dancers to follow, yet still had to allow conversation around the edges of the room. Before dancing began in earnest, guests observed one another. This quiet examination was one of the evening's most important rituals. Who had arrived? Who had not? Which woman wore a new gown? Which family had brought an unfamiliar guest who seemed unusually attentive to whom Victorian etiquette discouraged staring? Naturally, Victorian society nevertheless perfected the art of looking without appearing to look. Along the walls stood chairs and sofas for chaperones, elderly relatives, guests resting between dances, and anyone temporarily without a partner. These seating areas created a second world beside the dance floor, one made from conversation, observation, whispered judgments, and patient waiting. A young unmarried woman might remain close to her mother or chaperone until introductions began. Her dance card was ready. The tiny pencil hung beside it. A gentleman wishing to dance with her generally required some acceptable social connection or introduction before asking. The hostess, relatives, and mutual acquaintances helped create these meetings. Not every guest found the process easy. Some young men hesitated, some young women feared empty dance cards. Some mothers watched the room with the concentration of experienced strategists while maintaining expressions of perfect calm. Even now, historians continue to debate how calculating the famous Victorian marriage market really was. Satirical novels and memoirs often portray society mothers arranging matches with military precision, while private correspondence reveals friendships, affection, family pressure, chance encounters, and ordinary uncertainty mixed together in far less orderly ways. The ballroom was neither entirely romantic nor entirely strategic. It was simply one of the places where lives crossed. Flowers played an important role in shaping the room itself. Large arrangements might decorate fireplaces, doorways, staircases, and supper rooms. Ferns became especially fashionable in the 19th century, and exotic plants could demonstrate both taste and access to expensive horticulture. The Victorian fascination with flowers sometimes bordered on obsession. Conservatories allowed wealthy households to cultivate plants far beyond the ordinary English season. Florists supplied blossoms for events. Gardeners maintained greenhouse temperatures through cold nights. A rose appearing fresh at a winter ball carried more than beauty. It carried labour, fuel, transport, and expense. Scents gathered beneath the chandeliers. There was perfume from guests, fresh flowers from the decorations, beeswax or warm gas, polished wood, wine from distant rooms, and the faint heat generated by so many people enclosed together. Ballrooms became warm quickly. Fans opened, gloved hands lifted them in slow, repeated movements. Windows might be opened slightly if weather allowed, but draughts threatened bare shoulders and delicate flowers. Older beliefs about draughts remained powerful. Many people associated sudden cold air with illness, just as earlier generations feared unhealthy night air around monasteries, villages, and damp manor houses. A hostess therefore balanced ventilation against comfort with considerable care. At the edge of the room, conversations multiplied. Names passed quietly between acquaintances, introductions were made. Gentlemen bowed, women acknowledged one another. The first spaces on dance cards began filling. The musicians prepared for another set. Beyond the ballroom doors, servants moved through corridors almost unseen, carrying trays, checking lamps, arranging refreshments, and managing the endless practical needs of the gathering. Outside, the line of carriages continued. Their lamps glowed through the mist like a slow procession of watchfires. Inside, the polished floor reflected the chandeliers. A clock somewhere deeper in the house marked another late hour, though few guests seemed concerned by it yet. The evening had finally reached the moment toward which every earlier preparation had been moving. The clothes were no longer waiting in bedrooms. The carriage journey was over. The guests had entered the light. And now, beneath the music and the steady flutter of fans, the small dance cards hanging from wrists would begin to fill with names, promises, and the quiet social calculations that could shape the entire night. Once the ballroom had filled and the first introductions had been made, the small dance card hanging from a woman's wrist began to acquire its real importance. What had looked like a decorative accessory at home now became a map of the evening, its tiny lines filling gradually with names, initials, and promises that might determine where she stood, whom she spoke with, and how often she crossed the polished floor beneath the chandeliers. A gentleman wishing to dance approached with care. If he had already been introduced, he might ask whether a particular dance remained free. If she accepted, his name could be written beside it. If the card was already full, he might request a later dance or simply withdraw politely. The interaction lasted only moments, yet around it gathered an entire structure of social expectation. The choice of partner mattered because dancing brought two people into a closeness rarely permitted during ordinary daytime society. Gloved hands met. A gentleman guided his partner through figures and turns. Conversation occurred at a distance intimate enough to be noticed. This made the ballroom both liberating and carefully controlled. A young woman might speak with several men during one evening, yet each meeting took place within public sight, surrounded by musicians, chaperones, servants, relatives, and hundreds of other guests. Privacy was limited, observation was constant. Even so, the dance floor offered possibilities that the drawing room did not. A gentleman could learn whether a woman possessed humour, confidence, gentleness, or patience. A woman could discover whether he listened attentively, moved awkwardly, spoke too much about himself, or remembered the basic responsibility of avoiding collisions with other couples. A poor dancer could become memorable for reasons he had not intended. Victorian balls featured several popular dances, though fashion shifted throughout the century. The quadrille remained important for much of the period. It involved sets of couples performing organised figures, requiring memory and cooperation more than speed. The dancers moved through patterns, crossed, turned, advanced, and retreated according to established sequences. The effect could be elegant and almost ceremonial. It had something in common with older court dances, where movement reflected order and rank as much as entertainment. the waltz offered a very different experience. Its rotating movement brought partners closer together than many earlier dances, and when it first became fashionable in Britain, critics sometimes considered it dangerously intimate. By the Victorian period, however, it had become an accepted part of fashionable social life, though conservative observers still occasionally worried about excessive closeness or energetic movement. No one can quite agree on how scandalous ordinary families truly found the waltz once it became established. The strongest complaints survived precisely because they were written down, while countless people who simply enjoyed dancing left fewer objections behind. The polka introduced during the 19th century brought a livelier rhythm. Later came other popular forms such as the gallop, mazurka, and various versions of the quadrille. Fashionable dancers often learned these long before attending important balls. Dance instruction could begin in childhood. A dancing master taught posture, timing, steps, bows, turns, and controlled movement. Such lessons were not merely recreational. They trained the body in the manners expected of polite society. Standing correctly mattered. So did moving without apparent effort. A gentleman needed to guide without dragging. A woman needed to follow without seeming passive or uncertain. Both had to remain aware of other couples. The ballroom was crowded territory. A careless turn could send a skirt into another dancer, disturb a train, or bring two couples into awkward contact. The immense skirts of some Victorian decades made spatial awareness particularly important. Bustles created different hazards. A gentleman who stood too close behind a woman could accidentally catch a foot beneath the drapery. A bent wire beneath a bustle could alter the shape of the skirt for the rest of the evening. Servants and ladies' maids understood these dangers, which was why so much preparation had taken place before departure. Yet once the dancing began, control belonged largely to the wearer. Between dances, partners might promenade briefly or return to the chaperone. A gentleman was generally expected to escort his partner back rather than simply abandoning her at the edge of the floor. Such small courtesies revealed whether he understood the social language of the room. A mother or chaperone noticed. So did friends. Perhaps most importantly, other young women noticed. Reputation travelled quickly in a ballroom. A gentleman known for requesting dances and then forgetting them could become unpopular. A man who monopolised one partner too obviously might attract speculation. A woman who repeatedly refused invitations could be judged proud, although she might simply be tired. Victorian etiquette could be especially unfair toward shy people. Some advice manuals insisted that a woman should avoid appearing eager, while also avoiding coldness. She should converse without becoming too familiar, dance gracefully without attracting excessive attention, and enjoy herself without seeming uncontrolled. A gentleman faced his own contradictory expectations. He should be confident but not arrogant, attentive but not possessive, amusing but not foolish, interested but never visibly desperate. The ballroom therefore rewarded those who mastered moderation. At the edges of the room, chaperones formed a quiet network of observation. Some sat beneath walls decorated with mirrors or flowers, talking among themselves while watching the dancers. Others moved from room to room, greeting acquaintances and arranging introductions. Their conversations could influence the evening far beyond what younger guests realized. A mother might learn that a particular gentleman had recently inherited property. Another might mention that a family was leaving for the continent. A third might quietly note that someone's engagement was rumoured to be uncertain. Such information circulated gently, often under the cover of ordinary conversation. Victorian society depended heavily upon reputation, because formal records could tell only part of a person's story. Income mattered, family mattered, character mattered. Debts, drinking, gambling, previous attachments, and family disputes could matter even more. Much of this knowledge travelled informally. The ballroom became one place where it was exchanged. There were also more innocent forms of strategy. A young woman might hope to dance with someone because he was amusing. A gentleman could reserve a dance with an old family friend simply because it was pleasant to see her again. Cousins danced together. Brothers occasionally rescued sisters from empty cards. Married couples might dance, although the evening encouraged social mixing beyond one's immediate household. Not every name written on a card carried romantic significance. That fact is easy to lose when later stories treat every Victorian dance as the beginning of a courtship. Even now, historians continue to debate how closely fiction reflects actual ballroom behaviour. Novels are rich in meaningful glances and carefully selected partners because these create useful stories. Real evenings also contained tired feet, missed dances, forgotten names, torn gloves, spilled drinks, and acquaintances discussing completely ordinary subjects. The dance card itself sometimes survived as a souvenir. A woman might keep one from a particularly important ball, especially if the evening marked a first season, an engagement, or a memorable family occasion. These fragile objects preserved an unusual kind of record. A few handwritten names could outlast the music, the flowers, the meal, and even many of the people who filled the room. Fans continued to move as the temperature rose. A woman resting between dances opened hers slowly, allowing air to pass across her face and shoulders. Nearby, another guest might hold a vinaigrette or smelling bottle close for a moment. Heat was one of the hidden challenges of a successful ball. Gaslighting, where used, could raise the temperature considerably. So could hundreds of bodies moving beneath layers of clothing. Windows offered relief but introduced drafts, and Victorian households remained suspicious of sudden cold air. The result was a constant negotiation between warmth and ventilation. Servants might open doors between rooms. Guests stepped into conservatories, corridors, or quieter spaces when possible. Plants in a conservatory created a particularly fashionable retreat. Fern fronds cast delicate shadows beneath lamps, while damp earth and flowers offered a different scent from the perfume and warm fabric of the ballroom. Such spaces occasionally allowed more private conversation. Though social rules still followed the guests beyond the dance floor, a young unmarried woman was not supposed to disappear alone with a gentleman into some distant corner of the house. Chaperones remained alert to such possibilities. Older ideas of protection lay beneath this supervision. Medieval noble households had also guarded the movements and reputations of unmarried daughters, though the settings were stone chambers, chapel galleries, castle gardens, and manor halls rather than Victorian conservatories. Centuries changed the clothing and language. Family caution endured. Back in the ballroom, another dance began. Musicians raised their instruments. Couples moved into position. The polished floor caught fragments of chandelier light beneath their feet. Skirts turned slowly, expanding and settling with each movement. Dark coats passed between pale gowns. Flowers trembled in arranged hair. Watch chains and jewels flashed for a moment and disappeared again. Outside the tall windows, the street had become quieter. Mist gathered around carriage lamps where coachmen waited. Far away, a church clock struck midnight, its notes almost lost beneath the music. Inside, only a few guests glanced toward the sound. Many dance cards were now nearly full. The evening had entered its deepest hours. Feet were growing tired, and gloves were no longer perfectly fresh. Flowers had softened slightly beneath the heat, and somewhere beyond the ballroom doors, servants were preparing the next great ritual of the night, the tables, dishes, glasses, cold meats, sweets, fruits, and wine of the supper that would offer everyone a slower place to rest after hours of movement. By the time midnight had passed, the ballroom had changed in subtle ways. The first brightness of arrival had softened. Flowers that had seemed perfectly fresh earlier now leaned slightly beneath the warmth. Gloves showed faint traces of use. Hairstyles remained carefully pinned, but a curl or two might have escaped near the temples. Even the most energetic dancers began to notice the quiet pull of tired feet. Beyond the main room, however, another part of the house was waiting. The supper rooms had been prepared. For many guests, this was one of the most welcome moments of the evening. Dancing stopped for a while, conversation changed pace, and the body was given something more substantial than the light meal eaten before departure. The movement of the ball became slower here, less formal in rhythm even if the surroundings remained grand. Doors opened toward long tables covered with white linen. Silver dishes reflected candlelight. Glassware stood in orderly rows. Cold meats, poultry, fish, jellies, pastries, fruits, cakes, creams, sandwiches, and other dishes could be arranged depending on the wealth of the host and the scale of the gathering. Champagne and other wines appeared alongside water, lemonade, punch, or lighter refreshments. The abundance was meant to impress without looking chaotic. Victorian households valued presentation almost as highly as quantity. A large cold ham might be decorated carefully. Game could be arranged with herbs or aspic. Jellies trembled under the lamps in elaborate moulded shapes. Pyramids of fruit added colour to the table, while cakes and ornamental sweets provided another display of the kitchen's skill. Some grand suppers looked almost architectural. This tradition had much older roots. Medieval noble feasts also used food as a display of wealth and order. Trenchers, roasted meats, spices, decorated pies, and elaborate presentations filled great halls beneath smoke-darkened rafters. Victorian guests ate from porcelain and silver rather than wooden trenchers, but the impulse remained familiar hospitality was partly measured by what a household could place before others. The servants made this abundance possible. Long before the guests arrived, cooks and kitchen maids had been preparing dishes below stairs. Cold foods were especially practical because they could be arranged in advance, and served without requiring every plate to leave the kitchen at the exact same moment. Timing still mattered. A cream left too long in a warm room could suffer. Fresh fruit had to be inspected. Wine needed the proper temperature. Bread must remain fresh. Glasses had to be replaced as quickly as they were used. Servants moved through the supper room with the practiced attention developed over long hours. No one can quite agree on how smoothly the largest Victorian ball suppers actually operated. Published descriptions often emphasize glittering tables and effortless abundance, while household correspondence occasionally reveals shortages, broken glasses, missing dishes, servants sent running for additional supplies, or cooks exhausted by last-minute changes. Perfection remained the public illusion. Behind it, someone was usually working very hard. Guests entered in small groups rather than all at once when space allowed. A gentleman might accompany a woman with whom he had recently danced. Friends gathered together. Older relatives who had spent much of the evening seated along the ballroom walls now moved toward the supper tables with greater enthusiasm. Seating arrangements varied. Some supper rooms provided chairs and tables. Others encouraged guests to stand or move between smaller arrangements. In very crowded houses, finding a comfortable place could become part of the challenge. A gentleman was expected to assist the women in his company. He might bring a plate, pour a drink, or find a seat. This service was part courtesy, part practical necessity. A woman wearing a large evening gown, carrying a fan and perhaps a small reticule, had limited freedom to balance plates and glasses while navigating a crowded room. Her gloves presented another question. Eating while wearing pale, formal gloves was inconvenient and risked staining them, so they could be removed carefully or folded back depending on the style and moment. Managing gloves during supper became one more small skill absorbed through practice. A dance card might hang safely from the wrist. The fan could rest nearby. Jewellery remained in place beneath the brighter light of the supper room. At the table, conversation became looser. Dancing placed attention on movement and partners. Supper allowed broader groups to form. People discussed the music, the crowd, recent travels, upcoming engagements, mutual acquaintances, and the inevitable question of who had been seen speaking with whom. Gossip moved easily here. Yet Victorian manners still preferred it to remain indirect. Someone might observe that a certain gentleman had been very attentive. Another might mention that a young woman appeared particularly well. Such phrases could mean almost nothing. They could also contain an entire social judgment. The same ambiguity protected everyone. If challenged, the speaker had merely offered a harmless observation. If understood, nothing more needed to be said. The meal also revealed how long the evening had lasted. A guest who had eaten lightly at home might now be genuinely hungry. Dancing required energy. Heavy fabrics added warmth. The excitement of arrival had faded into a steadier physical tiredness. Cold chicken or a simple sandwich could suddenly seem more appealing than the most decorative jelly on the table. Some guests drank champagne. Its association with celebration made it increasingly fashionable during the 19th century. Though quality and availability varied, wealthy hosts could serve impressive quantities, and the sound of corks opening became part of festive dining. Moderation remained the public ideal. A gentleman who drank too freely risked embarrassment. A woman was expected to be particularly restrained. Victorian etiquette treated visible intoxication as a serious breach of self-control, especially in mixed company. Even so, wine flowed. Balls lasted for hours. Human beings remained human beings. Some contemporary accounts mention guests becoming louder or less careful as the night advanced. Though memoir writers could exaggerate such behaviour for comic effect, even now, historians continue to debate how representative these colourful descriptions were. The quieter guests had their own rituals. A woman prone to fatigue might take lemonade or water and rest near an open doorway. Someone suffering from a headache could use smelling salts. A gentleman with indigestion might regret having ignored the sensible meal offered at home. Domestic remedies remained close at hand. Peppermint water, ginger preparations, aromatic spirits, and simple herbal infusions had long been used for stomach discomfort. Chamomile, fennel, and mint had served similar purposes in medieval monastery gardens, where monks cultivated medicinal plants beside abbey walls. The setting had changed. The faith in familiar herbs had not vanished. The supper room itself offered a softer visual atmosphere than the ballroom. Candles burned steadily beside glass and silver. Servants moved behind chairs. Conversation rose in a low continuous murmur rather than in bursts above orchestral music. From distant rooms, the musicians could sometimes be heard preparing to begin again. Outside, the night had deepened. Carriages waited in long lines beneath the dark windows. Coachmen wrapped themselves against the cold. Horses lowered their heads and shifted their weight patiently. Rain might begin again, tapping against the street and darkening the stone. Inside, few guests could hear it. The house held its own climate of warmth, perfume, candlelight, and voices. After eating, some guests returned eagerly to the ballroom. Others remained seated a little longer. Age and temperament divided the room more clearly now. Young dancers still possessed energy for another waltz. Older guests exchanged slower conversation. Some mothers watched their daughters with growing satisfaction or quiet concern, depending on how the evening had unfolded. A young woman might glance at her dance card and find only 1 or 2 remaining spaces. A gentleman might check his watch and realize that the hour had moved far beyond the ordinary limits of his day. Still, leaving too early could seem disappointing. The last dances often carried their own charm. There was less anxiety about first impressions now. Introductions had been made. The evening's little hopes and disappointments had largely taken shape. Someone had danced more often than expected. Someone had waited for an invitation that never came. Someone else had unexpectedly enjoyed the company of a person barely noticed before that night. Nothing needed to become dramatic. Most evenings ended without a proposal, scandal, or broken heart. They ended with tired feet. That was perhaps more typical. Guests began drifting back through the doors. Servants quietly removed plates and replaced glasses. Food diminished from the tables. Champagne bottles stood empty among fresh ones. Crumbs appeared on the linen. The perfect surface of the supper room had finally acquired the gentle disorder of use. Somewhere, a clock struck another hour. The sound entered between conversations and disappeared. The ball was beginning to lean toward morning. Soon cloaks would be called for. Carriages would be summoned. Flowers would leave the chandeliers behind and return beneath dark wraps. And the guests who had spent the night moving through music, light, etiquette, and carefully measured conversation would begin the long, sleepy journey back through the quiet streets toward houses where servants were already waiting for their return. Eventually, even the brightest ballroom had to surrender to the hour. The musicians continued for a little while longer, but the energy of the room had changed. Where earlier there had been anticipation in every movement, now there was a gentler weariness. Couples still crossed the polished floor, yet the dances seemed less urgent. Fans moved more slowly. Conversations softened. The flowers arranged around mirrors and doorways had begun to lose some of their freshness beneath the warmth, and candles had burned noticeably lower in their holders. For some guests, this was the most pleasant part of the entire evening. The pressure of arrival had passed. The important introductions had already been made. Dance cards were nearly complete, and those who had spent hours worrying about whom they might meet could finally allow the evening to become simply an evening. A final waltz might begin. Dark coats and pale gowns turned beneath the chandeliers one more time. A train moved softly across the floor. Shoes that had been polished so carefully hours earlier now showed the faint signs of dancing. Gloves were creased at the fingers. A flower slipped slightly from an arrangement of hair and remained there because no one wished to trouble over it anymore. Perfection was slowly relaxing. When the music ended, partners returned one another to their places. A gentleman bowed. A woman acknowledged him. There might be a few quiet words about the pleasure of the evening, or perhaps an agreement to meet again at another social occasion already waiting on the calendar. Then the departures began. Guests moved gradually toward the cloakrooms, where servants faced another demanding hour. Coats, cloaks, hats, wraps, umbrellas, and overshoes had to be reunited with their owners. A number or description might be checked. A servant searched through rows of dark garments while another carried a velvet cloak toward the entrance hall. No one can quite agree on how orderly such departures remained at the largest gatherings. Some accounts describe astonishing efficiency, others remember confusion, misplaced garments, crowded staircases, and guests waiting impatiently while their carriage was located. By this late hour, patience could be thinner than it had been at arrival. Outside, coachmen received word that their households were leaving. The line of waiting carriages stirred again. Horses that had stood for hours shifted beneath harness. Lamps flickered in the damp air. Footmen moved between doorways and vehicles, identifying crests, colours, drivers, and familiar faces. The contrast with the ballroom was remarkable. Inside remained warmth, flowers, silver, music, and polished floors. Outside waited darkness, mist, tired horses, wet paving stones, and the long quiet streets before dawn. A woman's cloak was fastened carefully over her gown. The bright colours disappeared beneath velvet, wool, or fur. Jewels remained hidden at the throat. A gentleman put on his overcoat and collected his hat. The same people who had arrived looking composed and fresh now carried the gentle exhaustion of several hours spent standing, dancing, talking, eating, and remaining constantly aware of others. The carriage door opened. Once again, the train had to be gathered. Once again, the large skirt had to be managed through a narrow opening. This time, however, the movements were slower. There was less concern about entering perfectly. The evening had already been seen. The impression had already been made. Inside the carriage, the woman could finally settle into the seat with something approaching relief. Her fan rested closed beside her. The dance card, covered now with names and pencil marks, might be placed safely in her reticule or held loosely in one hand. A gentleman removed his gloves. The carriage moved forward. London at this hour belonged to a different world. Many windows were dark. Public houses had closed or were closing. Shop fronts stood silent. The great stream of daytime carts and pedestrians had vanished, leaving streets that seemed unexpectedly broad beneath the lamps. Here and there, however, signs of another working day were already beginning. Market workers could appear before sunrise. Bakers had fires burning. Servants in some households were rising while fashionable guests were only returning home. The boundary between night and morning was never the same for everyone. As the carriage rolled onward, conversation might gradually disappear. A younger guest who had been animated for hours could become suddenly quiet. A mother rested her head against the upholstered seat. A gentleman watched lamp after lamp move past the window. Perhaps someone mentioned one dance, one acquaintance, or one amusing mistake from the evening. Perhaps no one spoke at all. The silence itself could be welcome. The wheels created their own steady rhythm. The horses moved at an unhurried pace. Rainwater shone on the street beneath scattered light. Somewhere beyond the rows of houses, a church clock marked an hour when most respectable households were deep in sleep. Its distant bells belonged to a much older rhythm. Long before gaslit London, monastery bells had sounded through darkness, calling monks from wool blankets and cold cells toward the night offices. Medieval travellers had heard bells drifting across forests and winter fields, using their sound to judge distance and direction. Villagers had listened from cottages beneath soot-darkened rafters, while embers faded in the hearth. Now the same idea of measured time travelled across a Victorian city. 1 hour passed, then another. The carriage eventually turned into the familiar street. A servant waiting inside the house heard the wheels approaching. The hall lamp had been left burning. A footman or porter opened the door, and warm light spread across the steps. The family entered almost quietly. The great social performance of the night had ended. Upstairs, the lady's maid might still be awake or might have risen specifically for the return. Her work resumed immediately. Jewellery came off first and was returned to its case. Flowers were removed from the hair, pins had appeared one by one, the carefully arranged hairstyle loosened until long hair could finally fall naturally again. The gown was unfastened, hooks were opened, the train was lifted away from the floor and inspected for damage. There might be a small tear near the hem, a mark from someone's shoe, or a loose piece of trimming to repair later. Even now, historians continue to debate how often expensive gowns were cleaned immediately after such events, because methods varied according to fabric and household practice. More often, a garment could simply be aired, brushed, examined, and treated carefully where necessary. The corset was loosened, petticoats came away, stockings were removed, all the hidden architecture that had created the evening silhouette disappeared piece by piece. A dressing gown replaced silk and satin. The transformation reversed itself. Gentlemen underwent their own quiet undoing. The coat was brushed before being hung, the tie was untied, collar and cuffs were removed, shoes were placed where they could be cleaned later. A pocket watch returned to the dressing table, its chain settling against the wood with a small metallic sound. In earlier centuries, people sometimes placed charms, pilgrim badges, relics, or devotional objects near the bed for protection through the night. Victorian bedrooms might instead contain photographs, locks of hair, family Bibles, scent bottles, watches, and keepsakes. The objects had changed, but the instinct to surround sleep with familiar things remained. The house grew quiet again. Servants extinguished unnecessary lamps, doors were checked, the hall fire settled into embers. In the kitchen, only the faintest warmth remained from the range. Outside, the carriage had been taken back toward the stable. The horses were unharnessed, rubbed down, watered, and given their own rest after the long night. The ball itself was already becoming memory. By the following afternoon, callers might discuss it. Someone would remember a gown. Someone would mention an unusually crowded supper room. A mother might quietly consider the attention paid to her daughter. A gentleman might find a name returning unexpectedly to his thoughts. Yet much of the evening would fade. Music vanished first, then the precise arrangement of flowers. Then conversations blurred together. The dance card might remain in a drawer for years, its small pencil marks preserving names after faces had grown difficult to remember, and gradually, even those names would belong to another age. The chandeliers would be extinguished. The great houses would change owners. The horses and carriages would disappear from the streets. Gas lamps would give way to electric light. Silks would become museum garments. Photographs would turn sepia at the edges, and the people who had once worried over gloves, ribbons, invitations, and dance partners would pass quietly into history. But for a little while longer, the road home remains dark and peaceful. The carriage wheels move softly beneath the sleeping windows. Distant bells fade into the night. Firelight grows low behind curtained rooms. The last servants cross the hallway and close the doors. Beyond the city, fields lie silent beneath mist, much as winter fields had lain beneath moonlight centuries before, when travellers followed muddy roads toward abbeys and manor houses and watched for a warm window in the distance. Time passes gently through all of it, through castles and monasteries, through Victorian townhouses, through crowded ballrooms and empty streets, through generations who prepare themselves carefully for evenings they believe they will remember forever. And then, little by little, everything becomes quiet. The silk is folded away. The candles go dark. The bells grow distant. The road disappears into morning mist, and the old world can rest.